What happens when a man loses everything? His job, his money, his future, but still chooses to give away the only thing he has left? Adrian Brooks had exactly $11.40 in his pocket, enough for one last hot meal for himself and his 6-year-old daughter before he had to sit her down and tell her that everything was about to change. But on the walk home, he saw a woman sitting alone in the freezing cold, ignored by hundreds of passing strangers, and something inside him refused to keep walking. What he did next would cost him his last dollar, and it would change thousands of lives. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The termination letter had been sitting on Marcus Henley's desk for 3 days before he finally called Adrian into the office. Adrian remembered that detail later, 3 days, meaning his supervisor had known since Monday, had watched Adrian clock in Tuesday morning with a thermos of gas station coffee, had nodded at him in the break room Wednesday afternoon, had said, "Good hustle today, Brooks," when Adrian stayed 40 minutes past his shift to help unload a late delivery. And all that time, the letter had been sitting there, already signed, already decided. The meeting itself took less than 8 minutes. "We're restructuring the floor operation," Marcus said, not quite meeting Adrian's eyes. "Your position is being eliminated. It's nothing personal." Adrian sat very still. He had a habit of going quiet when things hit him hard. Not because he was calm, but because his body sometimes forgot to react right away, like a system that needed a few seconds to process an error it hadn't anticipated. "When?" he finally said. "Effective today. HR has your paperwork." Marcus slid a manila envelope across the desk. "There's 2 weeks severance in there. And your last paycheck." Adrian looked at the envelope. He didn't pick it up right away. "I've been here 4 years," he said. Not angry, just stating a fact. "I know." Marcus finally looked at him. The man had the decency to look uncomfortable, at least. "I'm sorry, Adrian, I really am. If it were up to me, is there an appeal process?" A pause. "The decision came from corporate. I don't have any authority to—" "Okay." Adrian picked up the envelope, stood up. His legs felt slightly strange, like he was walking on a surface that wasn't quite solid. "Thank you for telling me in person." He shook Marcus's hand. He wasn't sure why he did that. Some automatic politeness that kicked in even when everything else had short-circuited. He walked back through the warehouse floor without stopping. He'd spent 4 years in that building, knew the way the loading dock smelled on rainy mornings, knew which forklift pulled left, knew every shortcut through the stacking aisles. He didn't look at any of it. He grabbed his jacket from his locker, his phone, the small framed photo of Emma he kept on the shelf inside, and he walked out the side door into a gray November afternoon. He sat in his car for 11 minutes before he could make himself drive. But the drive home took 22 minutes on a normal day. Today it took 36 because Adrian missed his turn twice without noticing. He wasn't thinking about where he was going. He was running numbers. Rent was due in 9 days. He had $340 in checking and $80 in savings. The savings account he'd been building slowly for 2 years, dollar by dollar. The one he told himself was for Emma's future, for emergencies, for that invisible cushion between them and disaster. $340 plus $80, $420 total. Rent was $1,100. He had a car payment. He had utilities. He had the small monthly fee for Emma's after-school program, the one she loved, the one where she'd made her 2 best friends, the one Adrian had promised himself he would never pull her from no matter what. The severance was 2 weeks. He did the math 3 different ways, hoping one of them would come out different. None of them did. He pulled into the parking lot of a strip mall and just sat there with the engine running, heater blowing, staring at a dry cleaner's sign that had a burned-out letter in the middle, so it read Dry Cleaning. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "Thinking about you today. How's my girl?" He stared at the message for a long time. His mother lived 4 states away in Memphis, retired on a fixed income that barely covered her own expenses. He couldn't ask her. He wouldn't. He put the phone face down on the passenger seat. Emma got out of school at 3:15. He had to be there. Whatever was happening inside his chest right now, whatever that tightening, grinding, low-level panic was, he needed to have it contained before he stood outside the school doors and she came running out with her backpack bouncing and her shoelaces probably untied again, looking for his face in the crowd. He had to tell her something tonight. Not everything. She was 6, she didn't need the full weight of it, but something, because she wasn't a kid who missed things. She noticed when he was stressed. She'd started asking questions lately, careful and quiet little questions that were too perceptive for her age. And he couldn't walk around the apartment pretending everything was fine while secretly calculating how long they could survive on $420 before he found something new. He needed a plan. At minimum, he needed to feel like he had one. He looked at the time on his dashboard. 1:47 p.m. He had an hour and 20 minutes. He opened the manila envelope. The severance was $847. 2 weeks of pay at his rate, minus taxes, minus whatever deduction HR had applied that he didn't have the energy to read the fine print on right now. His final paycheck was $612. He had $11.40 in his wallet, cash. He counted it twice. A 5, 4 ones, $1 in quarters, 40 cents in dimes and nickels. He'd been meaning to deposit it but kept forgetting, kept thinking he'd use it for parking or a vending machine at work. And now here it was. His entire liquid capital sitting in his hand in a strip mall parking lot next to a sign that said Dry Cleang. He almost laughed. It came out more like an exhale. The checks wouldn't clear until tomorrow at the earliest, maybe the day after. Tonight, he had $11.40. He thought about Emma and the way she'd looked this morning. Half asleep at the kitchen table, hair sticking up on one side, eating cereal with enormous seriousness, like it was a task that required full concentration. She'd looked up at him when he poured her orange juice and said, completely unprompted, "Daddy, do you know what my favorite thing about school is?" "What?" "That you're always there when I come out." He'd laughed and ruffled her hair and told her he'd always be there. She'd gone back to her cereal like she'd just mentioned the weather. He put the cash back in his wallet. $11.40 was enough for a decent meal. Not fancy, not anything special, but warm and real. The kind of meal you could sit down to and feel human while eating it. There was a place 3 blocks from Emma's school, a little diner called Mickey's that had been there since before Adrian was born. The kind of place with vinyl booths and a pie case by the register and a laminated menu that hadn't changed in years. He and Emma went there on Fridays sometimes when he had a good week. She always got the grilled cheese and tomato soup. He always got the meatloaf sandwich. He could do that tonight. Spend the $11.40 on one good meal, one real dinner, and then sit across from her in that vinyl booth and figure out how to say what he needed to say. Tell her that Daddy's job had changed, that things might be different for a little while, that he was going to figure it out. He would figure it out. He had to. Well, Emma came out of the school doors at 3:17, 2 minutes late because she'd apparently had a very important conversation with her friend Jasmine that could not be interrupted by something as minor as the dismissal bell. Her left shoelace was untied, as predicted. Her backpack had a new drawing taped to the front flap, a purple elephant with what appeared to be wings. "She's a flying elephant," Emma explained before Adrian could ask. "Her name is Rosie, and she's very fast. Faster than a regular elephant? Daddy." She gave him the look. The look that said his question was so obvious it barely deserved an answer. "She has wings." He buckled her into the car seat and she chattered the entire drive, about Jasmine, about a boy named Theo who had gotten in trouble for putting a crayon in his ear, about the story their teacher had read today involving a bear and a missing jar of honey and a very confused raccoon. Adrian listened and asked questions and laughed in the right places, and by the time he pulled up near Mickey's, some of the tightening in his chest had loosened slightly. Not gone. Just quieter. "Are we going to Mickey's?" Emma asked, spotting it immediately. "Thought we'd have dinner out tonight." "Is it Friday?" "It's Thursday." She considered this with great seriousness. "Are we celebrating something?" "Just having dinner," he said. "Sometimes dinner doesn't need a reason." She appeared to find this philosophically acceptable and climbed out of the car, immediately reaching for his hand. She always held his hand in parking lots. He told her to when she was 3, and she'd never stopped, just absorbed it as a permanent rule, and he hoped quietly and irrationally that she'd never outgrow it. Mickey's was warm and smelled like coffee and fried onions. A woman named Gloria, who had worked there as long as Adrian could remember, seated them in their usual booth by the window. Emma ordered the grilled cheese and tomato soup without looking at the menu, because Emma already knew what she wanted in life and didn't see the point in reconsidering. Adrian ordered the meatloaf sandwich and a coffee for himself and a small milk for Emma, and mentally calculated the total. It came to $18.70 before tip. He had $11.40. He sat there for a moment, menu still in his hands, and did the arithmetic again like maybe he'd gotten it wrong the first time. He hadn't. He looked at Emma. She was drawing on the paper placemat with a crayon Gloria had brought her, a red crayon, her favorite, producing what appeared to be an early architectural sketch of a house with an impractical number of chimneys. He thought about downgrading, getting just a coffee, telling Emma he wasn't hungry, letting her eat while he watched. She'd accept that. She wouldn't question it. She was 6. He also knew that if she looked up and caught something in his face while he was sitting there with just a coffee, she'd ask what was wrong. And he wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Not here. Not with Gloria 3 tables away refilling someone's water and the pie case lit up at the counter and everything still feeling normal around them. He changed the order. Got himself a bowl of soup instead of the meatloaf sandwich. Skipped the coffee. Total came to $10.85. He had 55 cents left. He'd deal with tip from the change in his car. He had quarters in the cup holder. He'd make it work. The soup was good. Not remarkable. Just good. Thick and warm and honest. The kind of soup that did exactly what it was supposed to do without trying to be anything else. Emma ate her grilled cheese with focused efficiency, dipping each triangle into her tomato soup in a precise and personal ritual she'd developed somewhere around age 4 and had not deviated from since. They talked about Rosie the flying elephant. They talked about what it would feel like to fly. Emma said it would feel like being in a very fast car, but quieter, because cars were loud and the sky probably wasn't. Adrian said he thought she might be right about that. She seemed pleased. He waited until she was nearly done, until the bowl was mostly empty and she was working on the last triangle of grilled cheese with the kind of careful attention she brought to important tasks, and then he put down his spoon and said, "Hey, Em, can I talk to you about something?" She looked up. She had a small smear of tomato soup on her chin that she didn't know about. "Okay." "My job at the warehouse," he started. "I'm not going to be working there anymore." She chewed, swallowed. "How come?" "The company decided they didn't need as many people. It wasn't because of anything I did. It just happens sometimes." "Did you get fired?" The directness of a 6-year-old. He'd always loved and slightly feared it. Sort of. It's called being laid off. It means the job went away, not that I did anything wrong. "Okay," she said. "Things might be a little different for a while I find a new job." She looked at him carefully. There was something in her eyes that was older than it should have been. Not fear exactly, but a kind of quiet watchfulness, an awareness that the conversation had a weight to it that required her full attention. "Different how?" "We might need to be more careful with money for a bit. Like, we won't be eating out as much, probably. And some other things. Like my after-school program?" It hit him right in the sternum. He kept his face level. "I'm going to work really hard to make sure that doesn't change." "But maybe it will?" "Maybe," he said. Because she deserved the truth, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it cost him something to say it. "I don't know yet. I'm going to do everything I can." She nodded, went back to her grilled cheese, took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, then said, without looking up, "I can stop getting the chocolate milk at lunch. That's extra." He felt something split open very quietly somewhere behind his ribs. "You don't need to do that, baby." "I want to help." She finally looked up, completely serious. "I'm part of the family too." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Her hand was tiny and warm and had red crayon on the knuckle of her index finger. "Yeah," he said, "you are." They sat there for a moment, the two of them, in the warm diner with the soup going cold and the pie case glowing at the counter, and Adrian thought that whatever else was true about his life, whatever the next few weeks were going to bring, this was also true. He had her. And she apparently had decided she was in this with him. That made it both harder and easier. He wasn't entirely sure how something could be both at once, but somehow it was. He left 4 quarters and 2 dimes as a tip, everything he could pull from the car's cup holder without dropping Emma's bedtime routine past the point of no return, and they walked out into the cold together, her hand in his, breath fogging in the November air. The park was a block and a half from Mickey's. Adrian usually cut through it on his way to the parking garage when he brought Emma here on Fridays. It was a narrow urban park, the kind of place that existed between streets rather than because anyone planned it. A row of old oak trees, 3 benches, a path that connected 2 sidewalks. In warmer months, people walked dogs there and ate lunch. In November, at 6:30 in the evening, it was mostly empty. Mostly. There was a woman on the second bench. Adrian noticed her from half a block away, the way your eyes catch something that doesn't quite fit the pattern of a space, not because she was loud or moving, but because she was so completely still. She was sitting with her back slightly hunched, wearing a coat that wasn't thick enough for the temperature, a paper bag on the bench beside her. Her hands were in her lap. She wasn't looking at a phone or talking to anyone or doing anything at all. She was just sitting there in the cold, the way people sit when they've stopped expecting things to change. He'd seen people sitting like that before. You got good at not noticing them after a while, not because you were cruel, but because the city taught you that noticing required something, a decision, an action, an explanation to yourself about why this one and not the others, and most days you didn't have enough left over. He was about to walk past. Emma's hand tightened slightly on his. "Daddy, is that lady okay?" He slowed. The woman hadn't looked up. She was maybe 30, he guessed, though it was hard to tell in the low light and harder to tell when someone was cold and tired. Her hair was dark, tucked into the collar of her coat. There was something in the set of her shoulders, not misery exactly, but a kind of exhausted acceptance, like a person who had been sitting in the cold long enough to stop registering that they were still cold. He stopped walking. Emma looked up at him, then back at the woman, then at him again. He thought about the 55 cents he had left, the state of his checking account, the conversation he'd just had with his daughter about chocolate milk at school. "Come on," he said quietly, and changed direction toward the bench. She looked up when they were a few feet away, a sharp, reflexive alertness that softened almost immediately into something more guarded. Her eyes were dark, and there were circles under them that weren't just from tonight. She looked like someone who'd been managing something difficult for a while and had gotten very good at not letting it show, except right now it was showing a little anyway. "Sorry to bother you," Adrian said, stopping at a reasonable distance. Not too close. I wanted to check if you were all right. My daughter noticed you." Emma, who had been peering around his arm, offered a small wave. The woman's expression did something complicated, like something had been braced against a door and had just very slightly relaxed. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was steady. "Just resting." "It's pretty cold," Adrian said. "I know." He stood there for a second. This was the part where most conversations like this ended, where someone said they were fine, and you nodded, and you kept walking, and everyone maintained the comfortable fiction that everything was okay. He knew that. He'd done it before. He looked at the paper bag on the bench beside her. She had food, at least. One less thing to worry about. He glanced at the bag more carefully. It was empty. No, not empty. There was a small coffee cup in there, but nothing else. And the cup had that look of something that had been finished a long time ago and kept for the warmth of holding it. He made a decision. It was not a logical decision. Nothing about the next few minutes was going to be logical. "We just ate," he said. "There's a diner around the corner called Mickey's. They do takeout. I want to get you something warm to eat, if that's all right." She looked at him, really looked at him, in a way that was more careful and more particular than he expected. "You don't have to do that." "I know. Seriously, I'm okay." "You're sitting in the cold with an empty cup." He said it gently, no accusation in it, just an observation. "That's not really okay." A silence. She glanced at Emma, who was watching the exchange with complete open attention the way children do, no pretense of politeness or looking away. "Hi," Emma said to her. "Hi," the woman said. Something shifted in her face. I'm Emma. What's your name? The woman paused for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, except Adrian had a habit of watching people's faces. Vivian, she said. That's a pretty name, Emma said matter-of-factly. I'm cold too, but I have a coat. Vivian looked at the girl, then back at Adrian. There was something in her expression that he couldn't fully read. Not quite surprise, not quite something else, something sitting between the two. Sit with us for a minute, Adrian said, at least until you're warmer. You're a stranger, she said, not unfriendly, almost amused, or something close to it. So are you, he said. Doesn't seem to be stopping either of us. He left Emma sitting on the bench beside Vivian, after a very firm warning about staying exactly there and not talking to anyone else, and he'd be back in 4 minutes, and jogged back to Mickey's. He had his card. The severance wouldn't hit until tomorrow, but the paycheck might have partially cleared. He'd check, and if it hadn't, It cleared. Barely. He got a meatloaf sandwich and a soup and a coffee, all to go. When he came back, Emma was in the middle of explaining the full structural and narrative history of Rosie the flying elephant to Vivian, who appeared to be listening with what looked like genuine attention. She'd angled herself toward Emma slightly. The guarded set of her shoulders had changed. And her wings are purple because purple is the strongest color, Emma was saying. Daddy says you can have any opinion you want if you're willing to defend it. That's a good rule, Vivian said. Here. Adrian handed her the bag and the coffee. Meatloaf sandwich and tomato soup. Mickey's has had the same recipe for like 40 years, so it's not going to surprise you, but it's good. She took the bag slowly, like she was trying to figure out the catch and not finding one, and not quite knowing what to do with that. Thank you, she said, and then quieter. Why are you doing this? Adrian sat down on the bench on Emma's other side. It was 3 people on a bench meant for 2, which meant Emma was between them, sandwiched, and seemed to find this entirely acceptable. He thought about the question for a moment. When I was 24, he said, I had a stretch of about 4 months where I was pretty close to where you are right now. Not exactly the same, but close. And what I remember most isn't even the hunger or the cold. It's the way people looked through me. Like I was furniture. Like I wasn't even worth registering. He paused. I don't like doing that to people. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She had the coffee cup in both hands. The steam was rising. You don't know anything about where I am, she said, but she said it without sharpness. No, he agreed. I don't. Sorry, I didn't mean to assume. Another pause, then she said, You said you had a stretch like this, when you were younger. Yeah. What changed? He thought about it. Honestly, a lot of small things, none of them dramatic, just enough of them stacking up eventually. He glanced at Emma, who was now re-examining her paper placemat drawing that she'd apparently kept from the diner. And her. She kind of reorganized my priorities. You're a good father, Vivian said. She said it plainly, like a thing she'd just observed and decided to report rather than a compliment she'd constructed. He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he just said, I try, and left it there. They sat in the cold for a while. Emma eventually leaned against Adrian's arm and started to drift, the way she did after dinner, going boneless and heavy, with that specific tiredness of small children who have spent the entire day doing important work. Vivian ate slowly, not ravenously, carefully, like someone who'd trained themselves to eat slowly so they could feel it properly. After a while, she said, You're going to be okay. You know that, right? He looked at her. Which one of us are we talking about? She almost smiled. Both of you, maybe. He didn't know why it landed the way it did. He'd heard people say things like that before, people meaning well, saying the thing you were supposed to say. But she said it like someone who'd decided after looking at the evidence, like someone who weighed things before she said them. He reached into his wallet. The last thing in there was a folded $5 bill he'd missed in his first count, slipped behind his library card, invisible until he'd gone looking for something else. He put it in the bag beside her. I don't need... She started. Take it, he said. Please. She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes. Something passed between them that was harder to name than charity. Something more like recognition, maybe. Like two people standing on opposite sides of a river and understanding for just a second that they were looking at the same water. "Okay," she said quietly. He picked up Emma, who made a soft protesting sound and then went back to being limp and heavy against his shoulder. And he said goodbye to Vivian, and she said goodbye back, and he walked away through the park with his daughter asleep on him, and 55 cents in his wallet, and no job, and the November air was exactly as cold as it had been when they'd walked in. But something felt different. He couldn't explain it. He wasn't sentimental about it. He knew that doing something decent didn't fix anything. Tomorrow was still going to be tomorrow. The bills were still the same numbers. The problem hadn't changed. He just felt for the first time since Marcus had slid that envelope across his desk, like himself. Like the version of himself he wanted to still be, when everything else got stripped away. He shifted Emma's weight on his shoulder, heard her mumble something completely unintelligible against his neck, and kept walking. The next morning came the way bad mornings usually do. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, just gray light through curtains that needed washing and the specific heaviness of waking up already behind. Adrian lay still for a moment after his alarm went off. 6:43. Emma's school didn't start until 8:15. He had time, technically. Time to lie here and stare at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since before he moved in and think about the fact that he had no job to be late for, no warehouse floor to get to, no Marcus to nod at over a thermos of gas station coffee. He got up anyway. It was either that or let the thinking get louder, and the thinking had already been plenty loud at 3 in the morning when he'd woken up and spent 45 minutes running numbers in his head that he already knew the answer to. Emma was already awake when he got to the kitchen. This was not unusual. She had an internal clock that operated independently of the external world, set to approximately 6:30, regardless of what time she'd gone to bed. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a box of cereal in front of her and one of her library books open beside it, reading with the kind of absorbed concentration that made interruption feel like a genuine ethical question. He made coffee. Real coffee, the kind you made in the machine, not the gas station kind. A small decision that felt, for no entirely rational reason, like an act of resistance. He was not going to start day one of unemployment by skimping on coffee. "Morning," Emma said, without looking up from her book. "Morning, Em." "There's still cereal." "I see it, thanks." He poured himself a bowl and sat across from her, and they ate in the comfortable silence of two people who had been eating breakfast together long enough to stop needing to fill it. Outside, the city was doing what it did in November mornings. Garbage trucks, someone's car alarm, pigeons, the distant machinery of 8 million people starting their day. After a while, Emma looked up. "Are you going to be home when I get back from school?" "Yeah." She nodded. Went back to her book. Then, a few seconds later, without looking up, "That's kind of good, actually." He looked at her. "I mean, you're usually not home until 5:30, she said. "Now you'll be home, so I get to see you more." She said it with the matter-of-fact pragmatism of someone looking for the workable thing in a situation which was, he realized, an approach to life she had not learned from anywhere except watching him. He ate his cereal. "Yeah," he said finally. "I guess that's true." Well, he spent the morning after dropping Emma off. The way you spent the first real day of unemployment, when you were trying not to feel the full dimensions of it, by making lists. He was a list person by nature, something he'd inherited from a father he barely remembered and probably developed further on his own because lists meant control, or at least the feeling of it, which was sometimes close enough. He made a list of job sites to check, a list of contacts to reach out to, former colleagues, a guy he'd worked with 3 years ago who'd moved to a logistics company across town, a cousin who worked in facilities management and had mentioned once there might be openings. A list of expenses he could cut, presented to himself in order of pain level, starting with the streaming service he barely used and ending at the bottom of the page where he'd written it very small, with Emma's after-school program. He applied to 6 jobs before noon. Most of them felt like shouting into a void. Big company portals that swallowed your resume and returned an automated email that was somehow optimistic and meaningless at the same time. One of them, A warehouse supervisor position at a distribution center 20 minutes north of the city felt genuinely possible. He spent extra time on that application. Rewrote the cover letter 3 times. Read it back to himself out loud, which he'd read once was a good way to catch the places where you'd written something that sounded like a person, but didn't actually sound like you. He hit submit and then sat looking at the confirmation screen and felt exactly nothing, which was probably healthier than feeling something. He made lunch from what was in the apartment: eggs, the end of a loaf of bread, half an onion he found in the back of the refrigerator. The eggs were good. He ate them standing at the counter because the table still had his lists on it and he didn't want to move them. His phone rang at 1:15. Unknown number, which he usually ignored, but today he picked up on the second ring because today he was picking up everything. Is this Adrian Brooks? Yeah, that's me. Hi, Adrian. This is Denise from Meridian Staffing. We got your resume from a colleague referral, Marcus Henley, actually, over at Consolidated Freight. He paused. Marcus Henley, his former supervisor. The man who'd sat on his termination letter for 3 days and then shaken his hand and looked uncomfortable. Okay, Adrian said, keeping his voice neutral. Marcus said you were one of his strongest floor leads and he was sorry to lose you to restructuring. He wanted to make sure we had your name. A pause. He seemed genuinely regretful. I don't always say that. I can usually tell when a referral is just someone checking a box. Adrian stood at his counter with the phone pressed to his ear and looked out the window at the building across the alley. He wasn't sure what he felt about that. He filed it somewhere to deal with later. Thank you. And thanks for calling. The call was preliminary. She was looking to match him with warehouse and logistics management positions. Could he come in Friday for an intake interview? He said yes. She gave him an address. He wrote it on the back of his expense list because it was the only paper near him. After he hung up, he stood there for a moment. Marcus had given his name to a staffing agency. He didn't know what to do with that, whether it absolved something or just complicated it. Probably neither. Probably it was just a guy trying to do one decent thing after being in a position where he hadn't done enough of them. He understood that. More than he wanted to. The days that followed had a structure that Adrian imposed deliberately because without it, they would have become something shapeless and hard to manage. Mornings, drop Emma, come home, apply. Afternoons, errands, the library if Emma wanted, she always wanted, small tasks that kept his hands busy. Evenings, dinner, homework if Emma had any, her bath, a book, sleep. He cooked more than he'd ever cooked while he was working, discovered that cooking was useful in the same way that his lists were useful. It required attention that was small and specific enough to crowd out the larger, shapeless worry. He talked to Emma every night about something real. Not always the money, not always the job situation, but something true. Something that wasn't performance. He'd promised himself early in her life that he would not be the kind of parent who kept a perfect face on at all times, who smiled through everything and then wondered later why his kid couldn't come to him with the hard stuff. He wanted her to know that he got tired, that things were hard sometimes, that you could be tired and still show up. She, in return, continued to be herself, which meant she asked sharp questions and accepted direct answers, and sometimes surprised him with observations that had no business coming from a 6-year-old. 3 days after he'd lost his job, she looked up from her math homework and said, "Daddy, when you find a new job, can it be one where you're not tired all the time?" He looked up from the laptop. "What do you mean?" "At your old job, you always came home tired, like really tired, not just sleepy, the other kind." He thought about that. The other kind. She was right. There was a kind of tired that sleep didn't fix, that came from 8 hours on a concrete floor, and a supervisor who counted your bathroom breaks, and a commute that took 45 minutes each way on a good day. He'd stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing the sound of traffic when you lived near a highway. "I'll try," he said. "I can't promise, but I'll try." She seemed to accept that and went back to her edition. He stared at his laptop screen for a while after that, thinking about what she'd said, turning it over. The other kind of tired. 9 days after he'd lost the job, Adrian was in the laundromat 2 blocks from their apartment, a place he'd been coming to for 3 years, run by a man named Sal, who watched Korean dramas on a small TV behind the counter and never talked much but always had correct change. when he found himself thinking about the woman from the park bench. It wasn't the first time. She'd surfaced a few times in the week and a half since that evening, usually at odd moments. Once when Emma had asked about her again on the drive home from school the next day. Once in the middle of the night, when he'd been lying awake running numbers. Once, for no reason at all, while he was washing dishes. Not obsessively. Just the way people sometimes stay with you after a brief encounter. The way certain conversations leave a texture you keep pressing on without really knowing why. He didn't know anything about her. He knew her name was Vivian. He knew she'd been cold and alone on a bench on a November evening with an empty coffee cup. He knew she'd listened to Emma talk about a flying purple elephant with real attention, not the performed attention adults usually gave children. He knew she'd said, "You're going to be okay," in a way that didn't sound like something she was saying to be kind. He wondered where she was now, whether she'd found somewhere warm, whether that $5 had mattered, or whether it had been swallowed by something larger that he didn't know about. He put the laundry in the dryer and sat in one of the plastic chairs and stared at Sal's small TV, where a Korean woman in period costume was saying something with great intensity to a man in a hat, and thought about the fact that sometimes you met people at the exact right moment to understand something about yourself, and then they were gone, and the understanding remained even when the person didn't. He hadn't told anyone about that evening, not his mother, not his cousin, not any of the former coworkers he'd reached out to about jobs. There wasn't anything particularly secret about it. He just didn't have a way to explain it that didn't sound like he was asking for credit for something he didn't do for credit. He'd bought a woman dinner and sat with her for a while. That was all. It hadn't solved anything. His problems were exactly the same size they'd been before, but he kept thinking about her. What Adrian did not know, what he had no way of knowing, sitting in that plastic laundromat chair with the dryers running and Sal's TV playing quiet Korean drama in the background, was that the woman on the park bench had not been homeless. Her name was Vivian Cass. She was 30 years old. She was the founder and CEO of Cass Meridian Group, a privately held company that had grown in 6 years from a two-person consulting firm to a corporation employing over 4,000 people across 11 states, with divisions in logistics technology, commercial real estate management, and workforce solutions. She had been on the cover of a business magazine 18 months ago, though the photo had been taken with a certain deliberate distance from glamour. She'd insisted on it, to the photographer's mild exasperation, and she looked younger in person than in print, which meant that most people who knew her name didn't recognize her face, a distinction she found professionally useful. The day on the park bench had been her idea. Entirely hers. She hadn't told anyone on her executive team what she was planning, partly because she didn't want the liability conversation that would follow, and partly because she'd known they would try to talk her out of it, and she hadn't wanted to be talked out of it. The idea had started 6 weeks earlier, in a board meeting that was supposed to be about quarterly projections, but had drifted, as board meetings sometimes do, into something more fundamental. Her CFO, a precise man named Gerald Whitmore, who wore the same style of watch and slightly different metals depending on the day, had laid out the case for a significant restructuring of the company's lower-tier workforce operations. Redundant positions, streamlined management layers, a reduction of somewhere between 340 and 500 jobs, depending on how aggressively they moved, with projected annual savings of $14.2 million. The numbers were clean. The logic held. Vivian had sat at the head of the table and listened to Gerald present with the quiet efficiency she'd hired him for, and she'd nodded at the appropriate moments. And then she'd gone back to her office afterward and sat at her desk and felt something that she couldn't immediately name and didn't, at first, examine too closely, because there was a lot to do and feelings that didn't fit neatly into the work often got set aside. But the feeling didn't go away. She pulled the restructuring files, read them properly, not the executive summary, the actual files. The positions affected were in warehouse operations, facilities support, logistics coordination. The salary ranges were between $38,000 and $52,000 per year. She read through the position descriptions, floor leads, intake coordinators, receiving managers, people who had worked in those jobs anywhere from 1 year to, in several cases, over a decade. She'd built a company. She knew what that took. She knew that the clean number in a column had a person behind it, had rent and car payments and kids and whatever else. She'd always known that abstractly, but somewhere between knowing something abstractly and feeling its specific weight, there was a distance she'd apparently been standing on the wrong side of. She thought about the last time she'd been uncomfortable in the way those people might be uncomfortable. The last time she'd felt genuinely invisible, genuinely uncertain about what came next, genuinely dependent on whether a stranger chose to see her or look through her. She couldn't find it. Somewhere in the last 6 years of building something significant, she'd lost access to that particular frequency. She wanted it back. Not for sentimentality. She needed it back because she was making decisions that affected 4,000 people and their families. And she was making those decisions from inside a world that had become genuinely, dangerously comfortable. So she'd planned one day. One day as someone that the city was set up to ignore. No phone, no ID, no wallet, just herself in the cold, dependent entirely on whether the people who passed chose to stop. The first 3 hours had been worse than she'd expected. She'd positioned herself in 3 different locations over the course of the day: a park bench near a transit hub, a library entrance, a small plaza near a lunch crowd. She'd approached people twice, directly, once to ask for directions to a shelter, once to ask if someone could spare some change. The first person walked away mid-sentence. The second looked at her with an expression she recognized. Not meanness, exactly, just a rapid, efficient categorization, the kind that happened in under 2 seconds and ended with looking away. Several other people had simply walked past her on the bench without any visible awareness that she existed. She'd known, intellectually, that this was what happened. She'd read about it. She'd given money to organizations that addressed it. But reading about a thing and sitting alone in the cold, being looked through for 6 hours, were not in the same universe. By 4 o'clock, she'd been sitting on that particular park bench for 40 minutes, and she was colder than she'd anticipated. And she had begun to feel, underneath the experiment, something more visceral and less academic. A loneliness that was partly the cold and partly the hours, and partly something about the specific texture of being ignored that compounded on itself. She'd been thinking, seriously, about calling the whole thing at 4:30 and walking back to where her actual life was, when she'd heard small feet on the pavement, then a child's voice, then a man's voice, low and unhurried, asking if she was all right. She'd looked up at him the way she'd been looking up at people all day. With the reflexive caution she'd developed by then, braced for the rapid categorization, ready to be looked through again or spoken to with the specific tone of voice people used when they were technically being kind but were really just managing discomfort on their way somewhere else. And then he'd just not done that. She'd noticed things about him while they talked, the specific way her mind cataloged people even when she was trying not to run an analysis. The coat was worn at the elbows. The shoes were clean but not new. There were circles under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping well. He wasn't comfortable financially. That was clear without being stated, and yet he'd changed direction toward her bench. He'd left a 6-year-old briefly to go get food. He'd given her the money from his wallet. He hadn't said any of the things people usually said in those situations. Nothing about God, nothing about being blessed. None of the language that was really about the giver, rather than the recipient. He'd said that he knew what it was like to be invisible, that people who'd experienced hardship understood it. He'd said it without drama, the way someone states something they've simply found to be true. She'd asked him why he was doing it. She'd wanted to know, genuinely, because she'd been sitting there all day running what amounted to a study of human behavior, and he was the only data point that had broken the pattern in any meaningful direction. And she was someone who wanted to understand data points that broke patterns. After he left, she sat on that bench for another 20 minutes. She didn't feel cold anymore, which might have been concerning from a physiological standpoint, but felt, in the moment, like something else. She felt like someone who'd just learned something she should have already known but hadn't actually known, the way you sometimes didn't actually know something until it happened inside your body rather than inside your head. She called her assistant from the payphone at the corner. She'd planned for this, left the number on a card in her coat pocket, and had her car come. On the ride back, sitting in the warm back seat while the city moved past the windows, she'd thought about Gerald's presentation. The clean numbers, the 340 to 500 positions, the $14.2 million in annual savings. She'd thought about a man in a worn coat who'd given her his last $5 and said that people who'd experienced hardship understood what it meant to be invisible. She hadn't made any decisions that night, but the restructuring plan, which had been sitting on her desk awaiting sign-off, sat there unsigned through the rest of that week and then the next. Back in the present, back in the specific reality of being Vivian Cass, with a downtown office on the 14th floor and a board that was beginning to notice the restructuring delay with increasing impatience, she had a problem. The problem was not Gerald's numbers. The numbers were what they were. The problem was that she couldn't look at the numbers the same way she had before that evening, and she couldn't unsee what she'd seen, and she wasn't sure she wanted to, even if she could. What she wanted was more information, not about the market, not about the financials, those she had. She wanted information about the actual human cost of what she was considering, from someone who understood it from inside it rather than from the seat she occupied. She'd given her assistant, a brisk and exceptionally organized woman named Petra, one instruction: find Adrian Brooks. Petra had looked at her for a moment in the way she sometimes looked at Vivian when an instruction was unusual enough to require brief processing time. Can you give me a little more to work with? Late 20s to mid-30s, single father, daughter around 6 years old, was in the park near Delmore Street on the evening of November 14th, was wearing a gray jacket with wear at the elbows. She paused. His first name is Adrian. He might work in logistics or warehousing, I'm guessing, but I'd start there. Petra wrote it down with the same expression she used for everything, which was organized attention without visible judgment. Is there a reason we're looking for him? Yes, Vivian said, but I'll tell you when you find him. It took Petra 4 days. She found him through a combination of the staffing agency referral record. Meridian Staffing was, without Petra initially knowing this, a subsidiary of Cass Meridian Group's Workforce Solutions division, and a cross-reference of layoff records from Consolidated Freight, which Cass Meridian had a data-sharing agreement with for talent pipeline purposes. Adrian Brooks, 32 years old, former floor lead at Consolidated Freight, 4-year tenure, terminated in November restructuring. One dependent, no current employment. Petra set the file on Vivian's desk with the quiet efficiency that made her indispensable and said, I think I understand what this is about. Vivian looked up from the file. Do you? You're thinking about the restructuring differently. I've been thinking about a lot of things differently. Petra was quiet for a moment. She was 41 years old and had worked for Vivian for 3 years and had, in that time, developed a precise understanding of when to push and when to wait. What are you going to do with this? Vivian looked at the file, at the photo Petra had pulled from the Consolidated Freight HR database, a standard ID badge photo, not particularly flattering, the kind where you'd been told to face forward and not smile and then done exactly that. He looked tired. He also looked, even in a deliberately neutral photo, like someone who was paying attention to something outside the frame. I'm going to offer him a job, she said. As what? I'll figure that out. She closed the file. Set up an interview through normal channels. Don't tell him it's connected to me. I want to meet him without him knowing who he's meeting. Petra wrote something on her notepad. Then she looked up. Vivian, is this a good idea? It was a measure of how much Vivian trusted her that she actually considered the question rather than dismissing it. Probably not, she said, but I'm doing it anyway. The invitation arrived in Adrian's email on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after he'd lost the job. It came from a company called Synpath Solutions. He'd applied there weeks ago, barely remembered the application now, one of the many that went into the void. The email was professional, brief, asked him to come in Thursday morning at 10 for an executive-level interview for a regional operations director position. He read it twice, then looked up the company. Synpath Solutions was a mid to large logistics and workforce consulting firm. Solid reputation, had been growing steadily for several years. The operations director role was several levels above what he'd been doing at Consolidated Freight, which gave him a moment of doubt. He wasn't sure he was qualified. He wasn't sure the level was right. He called his cousin Marcus, different Marcus, his cousin, not his former supervisor, a point of confusion he'd long since given up trying to explain to people, who worked in the industry and knew the landscape. Synpath, his cousin said. Yeah, I know them. Good shop. That's, Adrian, that's a significant role. That's managing multiple facilities, probably 4 or 5 direct reports at the senior level. I know. I'm wondering if I'm underselling myself applying for it or overselling myself getting the call. Go find out, his cousin said. Worst case, you practice interviewing. Best case, he left it there. Adrian pressed his shirt that night. The iron was one of those things he owned and rarely needed. He'd bought it for a job interview 3 years ago and used it maybe 4 times since. It still worked. He ironed the shirt with the methodical attention of someone performing a task that was partly practical and partly psychological, smoothing out the wrinkles with a care that was really about getting his head right. Emma watched him from the doorway of the kitchen. You're going somewhere fancy? Interview tomorrow. For a new job? Yeah. She considered this. Will you have to wear a tie? Probably. She came into the room and sat on the edge of the couch with the authority of a person who had opinions about this. I think the blue tie is better than the striped one. The stripes are kind of a lot. He looked at her. When did you develop opinions about ties? I always had them, she said. You just never asked. He hung the ironed shirt on the closet door and looked at his ties. She was right about the blue one. He had no idea how she was right about the blue one, but she was. Thanks, Em. You're going to get the job, she said, in the same tone she used when she stated facts about Rosie the flying elephant. Total certainty, no ambiguity. You don't know that. I know, she said, but I think it anyway. He sat down next to her on the couch and she leaned against him in the easy way she had, shoulder against his ribs, already reaching for the remote. What if I'm nervous tomorrow, he said. He didn't usually say that kind of thing out loud. He wasn't sure why he said it now. She thought about it seriously. Remember that one time I had to do the thing at school where I had to read out loud in front of everyone and I was scared? Yeah. You said just talk to people like they're regular people because they are. He was quiet for a second. I said that? Yes. She turned on the TV. So just do that. He sat there for a moment while she found her cartoon, looking at the side of her face, the small concentrated face of a person who had just delivered wisdom and moved on because the wisdom was self-evident and the cartoon was waiting. He thought, I have no idea how I ended up with someone like you. He thought, whatever happens tomorrow, I have to be the kind of person she thinks I am. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and she didn't look away from the TV, but she smiled, the small private smile she had, the one she didn't even know she made. Outside, the city did its thing. The November air was the same temperature it had been on the evening he'd stopped at a park bench because a 6-year-old had asked if a woman was okay. The same temperature it had been when he'd handed over his last $5 without entirely knowing why. He didn't know what the interview would bring. He didn't know what the company wanted, or whether he was the right fit, or what the room would look like when he walked into it. He didn't know a lot of things. What he didn't know, specifically, what he had no mechanism to know, was that the woman who would be sitting across that desk on Thursday morning was the same woman who had been sitting on that park bench, that the $5 had not been forgotten, that the conversation about hardship and invisibility had lodged somewhere in someone's memory and stayed there, working on something, reshaping something. He just knew he had an interview on Thursday and a blue tie that his daughter had selected, and a shirt without wrinkles, and somewhere under the ordinary weight of the next few days, something that felt cautiously, carefully, like the beginning of a thing going right. Thursday morning arrived with the particular quality of mornings that matter, not different from any other morning in any visible way. Just ordinary light through ordinary windows, the same coffee machine making the same sound, Emma eating cereal with the same focused seriousness. But Adrian had slept poorly, in the way you sleep poorly before something important, not quite awake and not quite under, cycling through half-formed versions of conversations he hadn't had yet. He was up at 5:40, showered, dressed, stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the blue tie his daughter had selected and looked at himself for a moment with the kind of assessment that was really about nerve. He looked okay. He looked like a man who was trying, which was all he had to offer and would have to be enough. Emma appeared in the bathroom doorway at 6:15 in her pajamas. hair completely undone from last night's braid, holding her purple stuffed elephant, the one she'd named Rosie after her drawing, which had migrated from concept to plush animal via a birthday gift from his mother last year. "You look good," she said. "You're awake early. I wanted to see you before you left." She said it simply, without drama. Just a fact. She wanted to see him. He crouched down to her level. "I'll pick you up at 3:15, same as always." "I know." She held Rosie out toward him. "Take her." He looked at the elephant. Just in your pocket, for luck." She pushed the elephant slightly forward. "She's very fast. She can get there and back before the interview even starts." The elephant was about 4 inches tall, the pocket-sized version, a gift he'd almost overlooked in the wrapping paper because it had been so small. He looked at it for a second. Then he took it and put it in his jacket pocket. "Thank you," he said. She nodded with the gravity of someone who had just handled important logistics. Then she went back to her cereal. The address in the email was a building on Carver Street in the financial district, 31 floors of glass and steel that had gone up 6 years ago and still looked newer than everything around it. Adrian arrived 12 minutes early, which was intentional. He stood outside for 3 of those minutes, looking at the building directory in the lobby through the glass doors, confirming the suite number he already had memorized, giving himself time to settle. Synpath Solutions. Suite 1400. 14th floor. He went in. The lobby had the specific atmosphere of buildings that cost money to enter: marble floors, a security desk, a ceiling that was higher than it needed to be. He gave his name to the desk, got a visitor badge, was directed to the elevators on the left. 14th floor. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that was well designed without being showy. Neutral tones, good light, the kind of space that said, "We have resources, but we're not going to make a performance of it." There was a reception desk attended by a woman who appeared to be in her early 40s, with close-cropped hair and the organized efficiency of someone who handled 17 things simultaneously and made it look like one. "Adrian Brooks," she said before he reached the desk. "That's me." "Petra Halverson, executive assistant. Mr. Brooks, I'll let them know you're here." She picked up a desk phone, said something brief into it, set it down. "Can I get you anything while you wait? Water? Coffee?" "I'm fine, thank you." He sat in one of the chairs along the window wall. 14 floors up, Carver Street was a thin line of moving cabs and delivery trucks far below. He could see a slice of the park. Not the one, not Delmore Park specifically, but a different one, a stretch of green that was bare with November. He watched a pigeon navigate a thermal updraft for a moment, completely aimless, completely at ease with being aimless, and thought about what his cousin had said. Worst case, you practice. Best case, Mr. Brooks. Petra was standing beside him. She moved quietly for someone with such a precise energy. "They're ready for you." He stood, straightened his jacket, felt the small weight of the pocket-sized elephant in his left pocket, and did not take it out. She led him down a corridor lined with glass-walled conference rooms, all empty this early. At the end of the hall was a door that was not glass. Solid wood, plain, the kind of door that conveyed authority not by being impressive, but by being understated while everything around it announced itself. Petra knocked once, opened it, and stepped back to let him through. He walked in. The office was large but not excessive. A desk of dark wood, clean surface, a laptop closed and pushed to one side. Bookshelves on the left wall, actual books with broken spines suggesting they'd been read rather than arranged. A window spanning the right wall. And behind the desk, rising from her chair as he came in, a woman. She was 30 or thereabouts, dark-haired, wearing a gray blazer over a plain white shirt, and there was something about her face that registered in his mind the way a familiar song registers before you've remembered the name of it. A slight tuning in, a sense of recognition whose source wasn't immediately clear. She extended her hand. "Adrian, thank you for coming in." He shook it, and then she looked at him directly, and something in the angle of her face in the morning light through that window clicked into alignment with a memory. A park bench, a November evening, dark circles under dark eyes, an empty coffee cup, the particular set of shoulders of someone who had stopped expecting things to change. He went completely still. Not outwardly. He didn't step back or make a sound, But internally, everything stopped, the way a hard drive stops before a reboot, processing something it wasn't prepared for. "Please, sit down," she said. He sat. She sat across from him. The desk between them was clean and ordinary and completely insufficient as a container for what was happening in the room. He looked at her. She looked at him. Her expression was composed, but not entirely. There was something around her eyes that was watchful in a way that went beyond the watchfulness of an interviewer who was evaluating a candidate. He said, "I know you." It wasn't a question. He said it the way you state something you're not certain of, but are certain enough about that framing it as a question would be a kind of dishonesty. She was quiet for a moment, then, "Yes." One word. That was all. But there was something in it. A relief, maybe, or the release of something she'd been holding, some version of this conversation she'd been preparing for. "The park," he said. "Yes." "November 14th. "Yes." He sat back slightly in the chair, not retreating, just recalibrating. His mind was doing several things simultaneously, recognizing her, processing the distance between the woman on the bench and the woman behind this desk, trying to understand the geometry of how he'd ended up here, in this room, and what it meant. "Okay," he said after a moment. She seemed to have expected something more than that, or something less. His calm appeared to land in a place she hadn't fully anticipated. "Okay? I need a second," he said honestly. "This is a lot to recalibrate." "Take your time." He looked at the window, at the slice of city outside it, at his hands on the armrests of the chair. Then back at her. "You weren't homeless," he said. "No." That was deliberate. "Yes." A pause. I needed to understand something about how people treated someone in that position. I spent a day on the street, without ID or money, to see what happened. He thought about that, turned it over. And what happened? Her jaw tightened very slightly. Most people walked past, a few said something. One woman gave me directions to a shelter in a voice that made it clear she'd rather not be touching the same air. One man sat down next to me and asked if I wanted to share his lunch, but he also asked me twice if I'd considered calling my family, which... She stopped. It wasn't the same thing. What did he want from it? She looked at him. To feel like a good person, I think. Which isn't... I'm not judging that. People are complicated, but it was different from... She stopped again. He waited. "You didn't ask me anything," she said. "About my situation, about my family, about what choices I'd made. You changed direction. You came and sat down. You treated Emma like she'd done something unremarkable by noticing me." She paused. "And you gave me your last $5. How do you know it was my last $5? Something crossed her face. Not quite embarrassment. Something adjacent. "I had you looked into," she said, "after that evening. Your employment records, your financial situation. I want to be transparent about that because it matters." He went still again. A different kind of still this time. "You had me investigated," he said. "Yes." He let that sit for a moment. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. He searched for the feeling and found it was more complicated than simple indignation. There was something in there, something about having his information accessed without his knowledge, that was uncomfortable in a way he wanted to be honest about. But there was also something else, something that was trying to understand why, rather than just reacting to the fact. "Why?" he said. "Because I wanted to understand who you were, and because I was considering offering you something, and I didn't want to do that without knowing the full picture." "What were you considering offering me?" She held his gaze. "A position here. A real one. Not charity." The word hung in the air. He noticed she'd used it preemptively, which meant she'd anticipated his concern, which meant she'd thought about this carefully. He gave her credit for that. "Tell me more about that," he said. She told him. She told him about Cass Meridian Group, which was the actual company. SynPath Solutions was a subsidiary, and the interview invitation had come through that channel deliberately, to give him a neutral entry point before the reveal. She told him about the company's operations, the scope, the 4,000 employees across 11 states. She told him about the regional operations director role that was genuinely vacant, genuinely needed to be filled, not a position she'd manufactured for this conversation. She told him all of this with a directness that he noticed and appreciated. She wasn't softening it, wasn't packaging it prettily. She was laying out the facts the same way he'd laid out facts to Emma on that Thursday evening in Mickey's, because the person across from him deserved accurate information, not a managed version of it. The role involves overseeing 3 regional distribution facilities, she said, roughly 240 people across the 3 sites. You'd report to our VP of Operations, who is not easy to work with, I'll be honest. He's demanding, and he has a specific way of doing things that not everyone adapts to. But he's fair, and if you earn his respect, he will tell you so. What happened to the last person in the role? A pause. He took a position with a competitor. There was some acrimony around the departure. I'd rather you know that than find out 3 weeks in. He nodded. What's the reason you think I'd be right for this? She was quiet for a moment. Honestly? That's the only version I'm interested in. Because I watched you make a decision in the dark, she said, when you didn't know who was watching, when there was no upside for you, when the rational thing, the self-interested thing, was to keep walking. You made a different decision, and you made it without thinking about it very hard, which means it's not a performance. It's how you're built. She paused. I run a company with 4,000 people in it. The decisions I make affect them and their families in real material ways. I need people around me who understand what that weight actually feels like, not abstractly, not as a line in a values statement, actually. He sat with that for a moment. You can't hire someone for a significant role because they bought you dinner, he said. No, she agreed. That's why there's an actual interview process, actual qualification review, and 3 other people who will talk to you before any offer is extended. What I'm saying is that your character got you in the room. Your competence has to get you the role. He looked at her steadily. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. If I go through the process and it goes the way you're hoping, what is this exactly? Because you found me, you arranged this, you're the person behind the desk. What's the dynamic here? She didn't answer immediately, which he found more reassuring than if she'd answered right away. I don't know exactly, she said, and I'd rather tell you that than invent something that sounds cleaner than it is. What I can tell you is that I'm not doing this out of guilt, and I'm not doing it as a transaction. I'm doing it because I think you're genuinely qualified for a role I genuinely need filled, and because I had an experience 3 weeks ago that made me think differently about some things, and you were part of that experience. She met his eyes. But I want to be clear. This works or it doesn't based on what you can do, not on what you did in a park. He considered that. Something in the way she said it, not smoothly, not with the automatic confidence of someone accustomed to being persuasive, but with a kind of careful precision, like someone choosing words because the right words actually mattered, settled something in him. Okay, he said, let's do the actual interview. Something crossed her face. He thought it might have been the closest thing to relief he'd seen from her so far. Right, she said, and opened her laptop. Twang. The interview lasted an hour and 40 minutes, which was longer than either of them had apparently planned for, though neither mentioned it while it was happening. She asked him about facility management, about conflict resolution between floor operations and logistics coordination, about a time he'd had to make a decision his supervisor hadn't sanctioned and what that had cost him. He answered directly. He didn't perform confidence he didn't have, but he didn't undersell what he actually knew either. She asked him, if you walked into one of our regional facilities on day 1 and found that the floor leads didn't respect the systems the company had put in place, they had their own informal processes that worked for them but created gaps elsewhere, how do you handle that? He thought about it for a second, genuinely, not performatively. I don't come in and tell them their systems are wrong, he said, because if they've been running them for any amount of time, they're not entirely wrong. They're wrong in specific ways. And I'd need to understand what's working before I could be useful about what isn't. I'd spend the first 2 or 3 weeks just listening, understanding why the informal systems exist. Usually they exist because the official ones have a gap the people on the floor figured out how to fill themselves. And then I'd work with the leads to build something that kept what was actually working and address the gaps. Not my idea imposed on their reality. Both. She made a note. He noticed she wrote in a narrow, angular script, not neat but legible. The handwriting of someone who wrote fast because they were usually thinking faster than the pen could go. She asked him about his tenure at Consolidated Freight, about the restructuring, about how he'd handled being let go. He was quiet for a beat before answering that one. Badly, at first, he said. I sat in a parking lot for 11 minutes before I could make myself drive. Then I went and picked up my daughter and took her to dinner and told her as much of the truth as I thought she could handle. He paused. The next morning, I made a list and started applying. I'm not sure there was a third option. She looked at him. What was on the list? Jobs to apply for, expenses to cut, contacts to reach out to. He considered. And at the bottom, in small writing, the after-school program, as the last thing I'd cut if I had to cut things. I didn't want to cut it. She loves it there. A silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that held something. Did you have to cut it? She asked. No, I was at 4 weeks when your invitation came. He said it without self-pity, just a statement of timeline. I had enough from severance to hold another few weeks. After that, it got complicated. She nodded. Something in her expression had shifted slightly over the course of the interview. Not softer exactly, but less guarded, less carefully composed. Like the professional architecture of the room had gradually become less necessary for both of them. I want to tell you something, she said, and her tone changed slightly. Less interview, more something else. All right. I had a board meeting 6 weeks ago, before the evening in the park. We were presented with a restructuring plan, workforce reduction, about 300 to 500 positions, mostly warehouse and logistics operations. She watched his face. The savings projection was significant. The business case was solid. I was preparing to sign off on it. He went still. After that evening, she said, I didn't sign it. He looked at her carefully. Why are you telling me that? Because you should know, because it's relevant to who I am and what's happening in this company, and you'd be walking into that if you took this role. She paused. And because I think you might be one of the few people I could tell it to who would actually understand the full weight of both sides of that decision. What are you going to do with the plan? I'm still working through that. The financial reality doesn't disappear because I want it to. But there are ways to approach a structural problem that don't start with removing the people closest to the actual work. And I'm looking at those more seriously than I was. She held his gaze. It's not resolved. I want to be honest about that. He thought about Marcus Henley, the termination letter that had sat on a desk for 3 days, 8 minutes, nothing personal. The people in those positions, he said quietly, they have kids, she said. I know. Rent, he said. I know. And when it goes away, it doesn't happen like a business decision feels from the outside. It doesn't feel strategic or structural. It just feels like the floor went out. She didn't say anything. She was looking at the desk, at her own hands, and something about the look on her face was not the face of someone in control of a large company. It was the face of someone sitting with the specific weight of a thing they'd been trying to understand and had recently gotten closer to. Yeah, she said finally. I know. After the formal part ended, after she'd told him the next steps, that he'd meet with the VP of operations and 2 other senior team members before anything was formalized, that the timeline would be about 2 weeks. They sat for a moment in the silence that comes at the end of something that has been more than what it was supposed to be. Then he said, Can I ask you something? Of course. That day. On the bench. He didn't quite know how to frame it. Was it what you expected? She considered the question seriously, the way she seemed to consider most things. I expected it to be instructive, she said. I expected to observe something, to feel something. I didn't expect... She stopped, tried again. I'd been sitting there for most of the day. 6 hours, roughly. And by 4 o'clock, I was... She looked at the window. It's different when you actually feel it, being looked through. I'd understood it as a concept, I'd read about it, I'd funded programs addressing it, but sitting there and feeling it happen again and again, it compounds. Every person who walks past without seeing you takes a little of something. He nodded. He knew what she meant. He could have put words to it, the specific erosion she was describing, but he didn't need to because she was getting there herself. And then Emma asked if you were okay, he said. Something happened in her face. A small, unguarded thing. Yes. She asks that about a lot of people, he said. I'm not sure where she got it. I'd like to think from me, but she was probably born with it. She talked to me about her flying elephant, Vivian said, while you were at the diner. A pause. It was the first real conversation I'd had in 6 hours. With a 6-year-old, about a purple stuffed animal. She looked at him. I can't really explain what that was like, but it was something. He was quiet for a moment. She's something, he agreed. She is. She paused. When I was sitting there and you walked away to get the food, I thought you might not come back. Not because you seemed unreliable, just because I'd spent all day watching people not come back from their better impulses. They'd start toward someone and then redirect. Think better of it. I'd seen it happen 6 times. She looked at the desk. You didn't. I said I would. People say things. I know, but I said I would. He said it without particular emphasis, just the fact of it. And she was there, so... He gestured vaguely. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She almost smiled, a small, effortful thing. The elephant in your pocket, she said. He looked down at his jacket pocket, where the corner of the small plush ear was just visible above the fabric line. He'd forgotten about it, which meant he hadn't performed it, which felt right. She insisted, he said, for luck. She called it very fast. He looked up. The jury's still out. This time she did smile. It was different from the professional composure she'd maintained for most of the interview. Less constructed, less controlled. It looked like something she didn't deploy often, which made it feel more real. The next steps are real, she said, returning to the business of it. I want to be clear. I don't run things by giving people roles because I want to. The process matters. Garrett, our VP of Operations, will tell you exactly what he thinks, and if he thinks you're not the right fit, I will listen to that. I wouldn't want it any other way, he said. I know. She paused. That's also part of the reason you're sitting in that chair. He stood. She stood. They shook hands again, the same handshake as when he'd walked in, except now the room between them had a different geography, had been rearranged by an hour and 40 minutes, and the weight of some things being said out loud for the first time. Adrian, she said, before he reached the door. He turned. She looked like she was going to say something carefully considered. Then she seemed to decide against it and said something simpler instead. Thank you. For that evening. I know you didn't do it for... She stopped. Thank you. He thought about how to answer that. He could have said it was nothing. He could have said anyone would have done it, but that wasn't true. They both knew it wasn't true. That was the entire reason he was standing in this room. He could have said something gracious and forgettable. Instead, he said, Emma's the one who noticed you. I just changed direction. Vivian looked at him for a moment. Make sure she knows that, she said quietly, that it mattered. She knows, he said. She always knows more than I think she does. He walked out through the reception area, past Petra, who handed him a business card with the scheduling information for his next interviews without visible curiosity about what had happened in that office, which meant she already knew or had inferred and was exercising professional discretion about it, which he respected. He took the elevator down 14 floors, walked through the lobby with its marble floors and its ceiling that was higher than it needed to be, pushed through the glass door onto Carver Street. The November air hit him the same way it always did, the same city smell, the same cold. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment outside the building and looked up at the sky, which was the specific flat gray of late autumn, no texture to it, just a lid of gray from one edge to the other. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the small stuffed elephant. He stood there on Carver Street in his blue tie with his daughter's purple elephant in his pocket, and the city moved past him. Cabs and delivery trucks, and people with somewhere to be. And he thought about Vivian's face when she'd talked about the restructuring plan, about the weight of it on her, about the fact that 4,000 people were making rent and buying cereal and holding down after-school program fees right now because of decisions made in a room on the 14th floor of a building he'd just walked out of. He thought about 300 to 500 of them, and the conversation he'd just had, and whether the word change meant what it was starting to feel like it might mean. He didn't know what the next 2 weeks would bring. He didn't know if he'd pass Garrett's scrutiny, didn't know if the role would work, didn't know any of the things he needed to know about whether this was actually going to be what it looked like from where he was standing. But he knew that woman in that office was trying to work something out. He knew she was carrying something she hadn't been carrying before that evening in the park. And he knew, not with certainty, but with the specific quiet conviction that came from reading people over years, that she meant what she'd said. He started walking toward the parking garage. He had to pick Emma up at 3:15. He was going to be there. Emma was waiting at the school doors at exactly 3:15, backpack bouncing, shoelaces tied, both of them, which was notable enough that Adrian almost mentioned it. She spotted him from 20 feet away, and her whole face reorganized itself into the expression she reserved exclusively for seeing him after school, which was not a smile exactly, more like a relaxing, returning to something that had been slightly tensed all day without her knowing it. She ran the last few steps. "How did it go?" she demanded before she'd even fully stopped moving. "Good, I think." "Did you use the elephant?" "It was in my pocket the whole time." She accepted this as the correct answer and fell into step beside him, reaching for his hand automatically. "Did they like you?" "I think so. There are more interviews before it's decided. But they liked you today." He thought about Vivian's face at the end, the small, effortful smile. "Thank you for that evening." "Yeah," he said. "I think today went okay." Emma nodded with the finality of someone closing a case file. "I knew it," she said, and moved on to telling him about Theo, who had this time put a pencil eraser up his nostril and caused a significant classroom disruption, a development Emma clearly found both baffling and fascinating. He listened. He held her hand. He felt, underneath the ordinary forward motion of picking up his kid and walking to the car, something that was cautious and new and hadn't been there this morning. A small, careful thing, like a pilot light that had just caught. The next 2 weeks had a different texture than the weeks before them. The first had been formless, the shape of loss. These were the shape of something that might become something else, which was both better and harder in its own way. Harder because hope had edges that waiting didn't, because possibility meant there was something to lose again. He met with Garrett Okafor, the VP of Operations, on the following Monday. Petra had prepared him for the meeting with a single sentence when she called to confirm. "Garrett is direct. He'll appreciate the same from you." He'd found that a useful briefing. Garrett was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had made a lot of decisions and was at peace with most of them. His office was the most functional space Adrian had seen at the company. No art on the walls, a whiteboard covered in notes that hadn't been erased, stacks of operational reports with handwritten margins. A man who worked in his office, rather than performing in it. He didn't shake hands immediately when Adrian walked in. He looked at him first, a brief direct assessment, then stood and shook his hand. "Sit down," he said, and picked up a folder Adrian assumed was his file. The interview was different from Vivian's, less expansive, more surgical. Garrett wanted specifics, numbers, timelines, problems encountered, and exactly how they'd been resolved. He asked Adrian to walk him through the worst facility situation he'd personally managed and didn't let him generalize. "Give me the specific conversation," he said, "not the category of conversation, the actual one." Adrian gave him the actual one, a floor lead named Danny Reyes at Consolidated Freight, who had been running an informal inventory tracking system for 8 months that was 12% faster than the company's official process, but created reconciliation problems upstream that had cost 2 weeks of accounting headaches per quarter before anyone traced it back. He described the conversation he'd had with Danny, not the version where he'd corrected him, but the version where he'd sat down with him for 45 minutes and understood why Danny had built the workaround, and then worked with him to build something that kept the speed and fixed the reconciliation gap. Garrett made a note. Danny's still there? He was when I left. He's good at his job. Why didn't you report the workaround when you first found it? Because reporting it would have gotten him written up and fixed the symptom without understanding the disease. The official system had a real inefficiency. Writing Danny up wouldn't have changed that. Garrett looked at him for a long moment. You didn't have authorization to decide that. No, I didn't. That bother you? Bother me how? Does it bother you that you made a call outside your authority and it worked, and now you're sitting here partly because of that? Adrian thought about it. Actually thought about it. Not in the way you thought about interview questions, but in the way you thought about something that mattered. It bothers me that I didn't trust the system enough to use it, he said, and it doesn't bother me that the outcome was better than if I had. Garrett wrote something. Those two things are in tension. I know. That's why they both bother me. A silence. Garrett capped his pen. I've been at this company 6 years, he said. Vivian built something real here. I want you to understand that before we go any further, because what you're walking into if this goes forward is not a simple operating environment. We're in a transitional period, and there are decisions being made at the top that are still in flux. I need people in operations who can hold a steady line when the direction coming from above is uncertain. What kind of uncertain? Garrett looked at him directly. Vivian is reconsidering some structural decisions that affect the workforce significantly. The board has opinions about that. The tension between those two things is real, and it's not resolved. He paused. I'm telling you this because you should know what you're coming into, not because I want to discourage you. Do you agree with her reconsideration? Garrett was quiet for a moment. I think the original restructuring plan was financially correct and humanly costly in ways that weren't being fully accounted for. I think Vivian is trying to account for them now, it's the harder road. He paused. I work for her because she asks the harder questions. That doesn't mean I always agree with the answers she lands on. Fair, Adrian said. Yeah. Garrett stood, signaling the end of the meeting, and shook his hand again, this time with the full weight of having decided something. You'll hear from Petra by end of week. He heard from Petra on Thursday. 2 more interviews, both done by video call, both with senior members of the operations team who asked competent questions and seemed to be genuinely evaluating rather than going through motions. By the end of the second call, which ended on a Friday afternoon with Adrian sitting at his kitchen table while Emma colored at the other end, he had the particular feeling of a thing that had run its course and was now waiting on something outside his control, which was the hardest kind of waiting there was. He told himself he'd done what he could do. He believed it mostly. Emma looked up from her coloring. You're making that face again. What face? The one where you're thinking very loud. She went back to her drawing. It's okay, Daddy. Waiting is just what comes before knowing. He stared at her. Where did you get that? She shrugged without looking up. I made it up. Just now? Just now. He looked at his 6-year-old daughter coloring at the other end of the kitchen table and felt the complicated, slightly overwhelming thing he sometimes felt about her. This person he'd made, who kept turning out to be more than he'd made, who kept arriving at things on her own that he was still working toward. Yeah, he said. You're right. She didn't look up. I know. The call came the following Tuesday, late morning, not from Petra this time, from Vivian directly, which he hadn't expected. I wanted to tell you myself, she said. Garrett said yes, which, if you knew Garrett, you'd understand the significance of. He was standing in the kitchen again. He seemed to be always in the kitchen when significant calls came, which was going to make that room feel haunted in a specific way. Okay, he said. The offer letter will come from HR by end of day. The role is Regional Operations Director, 3 facilities, base salary of $94,000 with performance review at 6 months. Benefits start day 1. A pause. I wanted to say it plainly first before it became paperwork. He leaned against the counter. $94,000. His last salary had been $51,200. He did the math involuntarily, the way his brain had been doing math for the last several weeks. And this time the math came out differently. Came out the right side of rent and utilities and after-school programs and the slow, grinding arithmetic of not quite having enough. "I need to read the offer letter before I say yes," he said. "Of course. And I need to be transparent with you about something." A brief pause. "All right. I'm going to take the job if the terms are what you described, but I need to know that the terms are the terms, not something that shifts based on what happened between us." He chose the words carefully. "I need this to be a job, not a gesture." A longer pause. He heard her breath on the other end of the line. "It's a job," she said. "Garrett doesn't do gestures. He told me you were the best candidate he'd seen for the role in 8 months of looking, and Garrett doesn't say things he doesn't mean because he doesn't see the point. The offer is the offer because you earned it." He felt something loosen in his chest, something he'd been holding without quite knowing he was holding it. "Okay," he said. "Okay? I'll read the letter, but yeah, okay." Another brief pause, and then she said something he hadn't expected. "How's Emma?" He blinked. "She's good. She told me this morning that the reason butterflies have patterns on their wings is so they can read each other's moods. I don't think that's scientifically accurate, but I didn't have a strong counter-argument." A sound on the other end of the line that he was almost certain was a laugh, small and genuine, not performed. "Tell her Rosie would approve," she said. He smiled at the counter. "I'll tell her." Mugged. The offer letter arrived at 4:17 p.m. He read it 3 times. The terms were exactly what she'd said. He signed it that evening after Emma was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with a pen and the printed letter and the specific quiet of a house at night when a child is asleep in it. He signed his name, looked at it. Start date was December 1st, 11 days away. He folded the letter, put it on the counter where he'd see it in the morning, went to bed and slept for the first time in 6 weeks without waking up at 3 in the morning to run numbers that didn't add up. The first week at Cass Meridian Group was not graceful. He'd known it wouldn't be. New environments never were, no matter how good you were at what you did. There was the orientation machinery, the HR modules, the stack of operational reports Garrett sent him on day 2, with a note that said, "Read these before we talk Friday," and nothing else. There was learning the physical spaces. 3 facilities spread across a 60-mile radius, each with its own culture, its own informal hierarchies, its own version of the gap between how things were supposed to work and how they actually did. There was Garrett, who was exactly as advertised, demanding, direct, fair, in the specific way of someone who applied the same standard to everyone, including himself. He called Adrian on the 3rd day and said, without preamble, "Your read on the Eastfield facility. What did you see?" Adrian had been at Eastfield the day before for an introductory walkthrough. He gave Garrett his honest read. Strong floor team, undertrained middle management, a shift supervisor named Carla Voss who was carrying more operational responsibility than her title reflected and knew it, which had created a resentment that was subtle but present and was going to become a retention problem inside 6 months if someone didn't address it directly. A pause on Garrett's end. "How long were you there?" 4 hours. Another pause. "Carla's been on my list for a while." "What would you do with her?" "Promote her or lose her. She's not going to stay in a position that doesn't match what she's actually doing." A beat. "Probably promote her. She knows that facility better than anyone on paper above her." "Talk to me about that in the Friday call," Garrett said, and hung up. It was blunt. It was also, Adrian was beginning to understand, respect, Garrett's version of it, which didn't come with warmth or affirmation, just the signal that you'd said something worth continuing. He wasn't always right. He made a call in his 2nd week about inventory scheduling at the 2nd facility, Millbrook, that turned out to be based on a misread of the data. He'd pulled from a report that hadn't been updated after a systems migration 6 months earlier, and the numbers had looked like an inefficiency that wasn't actually there. He caught it before it went anywhere, corrected it himself, told Garrett before Garrett had to find it. "How'd you catch it?" Garrett asked. "A floor lead named Torres asked me a question that didn't make sense if my read was right. So I went back." What did you do when you found the error? Corrected it and called you. Not typical, Garrett said. Not a compliment, just an observation. It was my mistake, Adrian said. There's no version of that where you find out from someone else. Garrett was quiet for a moment. No, he said. There isn't. He settled. Not smoothly. He wasn't a smooth settler, never had been. But genuinely, the way you settle into something that fits in the places that matter even when the fit isn't perfect everywhere else. He learned the 3 facilities the way he'd learned the warehouse at Consolidated Freight. By being present, by listening before talking, by understanding the informal systems before touching the official ones. Carla Voss at Eastfield got promoted. She came to Adrian's office, a small one, still getting used to having an office with a door, on the day it was announced and stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression that was complicated. I heard you went to bat for this, she said. Garrett made the decision. Garrett doesn't make decisions he doesn't think are right. But someone put it in front of him the right way. She paused. I've been here 6 years. I applied for a supervisor role twice and was told I needed more experience, and the person who got it both times had less tenure than me. Something passed through her face. I just want you to know that I see what you did, and I'm going to work to deserve it. You already deserved it, he said. I just said so out loud. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and went back to work. He watched her go and thought about things being said out loud. About the gap between what was true and what was acknowledged. About how many Carla Vosses were in how many facilities running on unofficial authority with official resentment building underneath. And how much of the attrition that looked like turnover statistics was actually that gap, repeated across thousands of people over years. He wrote a memo about it, not a formal operational report, just a memo. His observations from the first month across all 3 facilities, the patterns he'd seen, the places where the structure didn't match the reality of who was doing what. He sent it to Garrett, who read it and said, in their next call, the board's not going to like this. I'm not sending it to the board, I'm sending it to you. I report to the board. I know, but first I'm sending it to you, because these are my observations and you should have them. A pause. What you do with them is your call. Garrett made a sound that Adrian had started to learn was his version of a conceding point. Come to the strategy session next month, Garrett said. Bring this. Vivian called him on a Thursday afternoon in his 3rd week, without Petra in the middle of it. He was driving between Eastfield and Millbrook, the 60-mile stretch of highway that connected the 2, flat farmland on either side going gray and frost-edged in December. How's the first month? She asked. Honest answer or professional answer? Honest. Harder than I expected and better than I expected, roughly in equal measure. He kept his eyes on the road. He's the best manager I've ever worked with, which is a strange thing to say because he's also the hardest. He'd find that amusing. He has strong feelings about the word hard as a compliment. What would he prefer? Exacting, she said. He thinks hard implies something punishing. Exacting implies something rigorous. He considers it a meaningful distinction. It is a meaningful distinction, Adrian said, and she laughed. The real laugh again, the one that came without architecture. After a moment, she said, I wanted to talk to you about something, not operational. All right. The restructuring. He heard her take a breath. I've been working through alternatives with Gerald for the past several weeks. The financial targets that drove the original plan. Some of those pressures are real, and I can't pretend they're not. But I think we've been treating cost reduction and workforce stability as if they're on opposite sides of an equation that only has one solution. A pause. They're not. What does that mean practically? It means instead of eliminating 300 to 500 positions, we're looking at a combination of things. Supply chain efficiency improvements in our logistics tech division that have been on the roadmap for 2 years and keep getting deprioritized. A restructuring of management overhead that no one wanted to touch because those are more visible and politically uncomfortable decisions, and a phased renegotiation of 3 facility contracts that have been running on terms that made sense in 2019 and don't anymore. She paused. Combined, it gets us to within about 70% of Gerald's target number. The remaining gap we're going to absorb into a longer timeline and argue for at the next board meeting. He drove for a moment in silence. On either side of the highway, the frost-edged fields went on, flat and gray and still. "How's the board taking it?" he said. "Gerald is deeply unhappy." A beat. Gerald is often deeply unhappy, so that's not entirely diagnostic. But this particular unhappiness is more pointed than usual. He thinks I'm making a sentimental decision dressed up in operational language. "Are you?" A silence. A real one. "I don't think so," she said finally. "I think there's a genuine operational case for workforce stability that gets systematically underweighted in these analyses, because turnover costs are distributed across time in ways that don't show up cleanly in a one-year savings projection. Gerald's model is correct about what it measures. I think it's measuring the wrong things." A pause. "But I'm also aware that I went and sat on a park bench in November and came back and started questioning a board-approved plan, and that those two things happened in sequence, and that reasonable people could argue the sequence matters." "Does the sequence matter?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I keep trying to separate the experience from the analysis, and I'm not sure they're separable. Maybe they're not supposed to be." He thought about Emma saying, "You can have any opinion you want if you're willing to defend it," about a 6-year-old's pragmatic epistemology delivered over grilled cheese. "If the operational case holds up," he said, "then it holds up regardless of why you went looking for it." That's a generous framing. It's an accurate one. He slowed for an exit. Gerald's model was also developed by someone who had reasons for the assumptions he built into it. All the models have a person behind them. A pause. "I'm going to use that in the board meeting," she said. "Good luck?" "I'll need it. He's formidable." "So are you," Adrian said. He said it the same way she'd said things to him, matter-of-factly, like an observation rather than a compliment. "You built something 4,000 people depend on. That's not an accident." She was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes it feels like it was," she said, "like the pieces happened to fall a certain way, and I happened to be there holding them." "Maybe," he said. "But you held them." Another silence, different from the professional ones. "How's Emma?" she said, shifting back to something easier. "She has a new theory about clouds," he said. "She thinks they move faster at night because there's no traffic." The laugh again. "She's going to be extraordinary." "She already is," he said. "I'm just trying to keep up." The board meeting happened on the second Tuesday of January. Adrian wasn't in it. It wasn't his level, his facility, but he knew it was happening the way you know things in a building where decisions of that size are being made. There was a specific quality to the air in the 14th floor suite that week, a tension that wasn't hostile but was present, the way weather is present before it breaks. Petra texted him at 4:17 p.m. "She's still in there." He was at the Eastfield facility when he got it, walking the receiving dock with a floor supervisor named Ray, who was showing him a bottleneck in the inbound freight flow. He read the text and kept walking. There was nothing he could do about what was happening in that room. There was only the dock in front of him and Ray's explanation and the specific problem they were here to address, which was real and present and his to work on. He texted back, "Thanks for the update. Petra, 3 minutes later, she'll be fine." He believed that. He didn't know everything about Vivian Cass, but he knew she'd walked into a room on a November afternoon knowing she'd be looked through, and she'd sat with it for 6 hours, and she'd come back different. Not fragile, not angry, just different, in the way that came from letting something actually land. That kind of person could handle a board meeting. He put his phone away and looked at the bottleneck with Ray. She called him the next morning. "How did it go?" he asked, before she said anything else. "Gerald is angrier than I've ever seen him," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a tiredness that was not defeat, but was the specific exhaustion that came from spending 6 hours defending something you believed in against people who were smart and wrong. He made a very compelling argument for the original plan. 2 other board members sided with him. It was close. But it passed. The modified plan. A long exhale. Narrowly. With conditions attached, the technology investment has to show measurable returns by Q3, or we revisit the workforce question, which is, it's a tight window, but it's a real window. He stood at his kitchen counter in the early morning quiet, the coffee machine running, Emma still asleep down the hall. Vivian, yeah, you just kept 300 to 500 people in their jobs. A silence. Then, we don't know that. Gerald might be right. The Q3 targets might not. I know, but right now, today, you kept them. He paused. That matters. That's not nothing. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was slightly different. Not by much, but he'd been learning to hear the difference between her professional voice and the other one. No, she said. It's not nothing. Garrett's memo, he said. Did you use the workforce stability argument? Extensively. Garrett thinks I over-indexed on the human element and under-indexed on the market risk. He's probably right about the market risk. A pause. He voted with me anyway. He voted with you? He told me afterward it was because my operational case was stronger than my financial case, and he could defend the operational case. He's going to be very difficult to work with for the next 3 months while he waits to see if he was right. Something in her voice, not quite amusement, something adjacent. Garrett's version of trust is very expensive. Worth it, though, Adrian said. Yeah, she said. Yeah, it is. The coffee machine beeped. Down the hall, he heard Emma begin the specific sounds of waking up. A muffled protest against consciousness, the thump of small feet finding the floor, the shuffle that was her making her way to the bathroom with her eyes probably still mostly closed. I have to get her up, he said. Of course. Adrian, she paused. Thank you for the thing you said about keeping them. It's true. I know, but sometimes you need to hear true things from someone outside your own head. A pause. I'm learning that. He heard Emma's bathroom door close, the reliable little machine of their morning getting underway. Me too, he said. Me too. December became January. January settled into the particular routine of a life that had found its footing without being entirely sure when that happened. He drove the 60-mile stretch between facilities. He had the Friday calls with Garrett. He sat across from Carla Voss in her new office at Eastfield and watched her become the supervisor she'd been doing the work of for 6 years without the title, and felt something about that which wasn't pride exactly, but was close to it, the satisfaction of a thing going correctly. Emma started the second half of the school year and reported that Theo had largely stopped putting objects in his face holes, a development she found encouraging. She was reading 2 grade levels ahead and had a new best friend named Priya who could hold her breath for 45 seconds, which Emma found deeply impressive. She still held his hand in parking lots. He still hoped she never stopped. He didn't talk about the job at home the way people sometimes talked about work, bringing its weight through the door, setting it down in the kitchen, letting it take up space in the evenings. He kept the boundaries deliberately, not because the job wasn't important, but because Emma was important in a way that predated and outweighed every other importance, and the evenings were hers. He helped with homework. He made dinner from scratch more than he'd ever managed when he was at the warehouse, because the hours were different and the exhaustion was different. Less physical, more mental, the kind that cooking actually helped. He called his mother on Sunday nights. She asked about Emma. She asked about the new job, and he told her it was going well, which was true, and that he was figuring it out, which was also true. And she said she was proud of him in the way she always said it, directly, without embellishment, as if pride were a fact to be reported rather than a sentiment to be performed. He loved his mother for that. He didn't say so often enough. He thought about the evening in the park sometimes, less frequently than he had in the weeks right after, but it was still there, the way certain evenings stayed in the memory because something about them felt like a hinge, like the particular configuration of small things, a paper bag, an empty cup, a child's question, a changed direction, had done something to the structure of what came after. He was not a person who believed in fate. He believed in decisions. He believed that the decisions people made when they thought no one was watching were the truest version of who they were, and that those decisions accumulated over time into something like character, and that character was the thing that either held or didn't when the floor went out. What he hadn't known on that bench in November was that someone was watching, not in any mystical sense, just a woman, cold and tired, sitting with an empty coffee cup, paying attention because she'd come there to pay attention. He hadn't changed direction for her because he thought it would matter beyond the next hour. He'd changed direction because Emma had asked if she was okay, and because he knew what it felt like to be invisible, and because the right thing was occasionally just the right thing regardless of return. That it had returned anyway, that the $5 and the meatloaf sandwich and the 40 minutes on a cold bench had somehow traced a line through Petra's research and Garrett's exacting standards and a board meeting in January to the specific life he was now living, was something he turned over occasionally, not with awe or gratitude in any performed sense, but with a kind of honest bewilderment at the particular geometry of how things connected. He did not think he was special for what he'd done. He thought he'd done the thing that was in front of him to do. He thought a lot of people would have done the same if they'd stopped. The stopping was the thing. The stopping was always the thing. He kept the pocket-sized elephant on his desk at work, not displayed, just present, tucked in the corner beside the small plant Carla had given him when he'd moved into the office, a succulent that required very little attention, which she'd said she chose deliberately. He'd laughed. He still wasn't sure if it had been a compliment. Garrett had noticed it once, early on, had looked at it without comment, then looked at Adrian, then looked back at his report. Garrett, Adrian had come to understand, filed things away and brought them out only when they were operationally relevant. The elephant went in the file. He didn't know when it would come out, but it would. Everything was still imperfect. The Q3 targets were real and not guaranteed. Gerald and Garrett remained in a cold, professional truce that Vivian was managing by being brilliant and exhausting about it. The second facility, Millbrook, had a union negotiation coming up in the spring that nobody was looking forward to. Adrian had made 3 decisions in his first month that he'd had to revisit, 2 of which had been recoverable and 1 of which was still recoverable but was taking longer than he'd like. None of it was smooth. He hadn't expected smooth. What he had was traction. The specific feeling of effort that was going somewhere, of a direction that held. On a Friday in the middle of January, a day that was specifically unremarkable in every way he could name, he drove the 60 miles from Millbrook back toward the city in the late afternoon, the winter sun already low over the flat fields, the radio on low. He thought about nothing in particular. He thought about what to make for dinner. He thought about a problem at Eastfield that was still unresolved and would need attention Monday. He thought about his mother and whether he'd told her about the board meeting outcome. He thought about Vivian's voice on the phone when he'd said you kept them, the small exhale, the way she'd been quiet for a moment before answering. He thought about Emma in the diner, a grilled cheese triangle in one hand, looking at him across a table on the worst financial day of his adult life and saying, I can stop getting the chocolate milk at lunch. That's extra. I want to help. I'm part of the family too. He drove. The sun went lower. The city appeared on the horizon as a cluster of lights in the gray, the specific shape of it familiar in the way that home is familiar. Not because it was perfect, but because it was his, because Emma was there, because the kitchen was waiting and the evening was waiting, and tomorrow was Saturday, which meant the library in the morning if Emma wanted, which she always wanted. He took the exit for the city and felt the particular thing that he had no very precise name for. Not happiness exactly, not relief, not gratitude in any organized sense. Just the feeling of being where he was supposed to be, doing what he was supposed to be doing, with the person he was supposed to be doing it with. Enough. More than enough. He pressed the turn signal and headed home. Spring came late that year, the way it sometimes did in that part of the country. Reluctantly, in fits and starts, a warm week followed by a cold snap, followed by another warm week. The trees not quite trusting the change enough to commit to it. By the middle of March, there were crocuses in the small strip of soil between the sidewalk and the apartment building's front step, which Emma monitored with a seriousness that bordered on scientific. She reported on them each morning during the drive to school. Purple ones first, then yellow, then a white one that appeared alone on a Wednesday and that she named Harold. Why Harold? Adrian asked. He looks like a herald, she said, with the complete certainty of someone who had never had to defend an opinion about crocus names before and didn't anticipate needing to start. He didn't argue. He'd stopped arguing about names. He'd learned that Emma's instinct about names was usually right in a way he couldn't explain, which was probably the same instinct she had about blue ties and flying elephants and what cloud movement meant. A kind of pattern recognition that didn't rely on the same pathways most people used. He thought she might grow up to be someone who understood things sideways, coming at problems from angles that other people didn't think to try. He thought she was already that person, in the small contained version of herself that was 7 years old and monitoring crocuses and reporting on them like a correspondent in the field. 7. She'd turned 7 in February. He'd taken the day off work. Garrett had not commented on this, which from Garrett was the same as enthusiastic endorsement. And they'd gone to the Natural History Museum, her choice, where she spent 45 minutes in front of the dinosaur exhibit, asking questions that the exhibit placards couldn't answer and looking mildly frustrated about it. They'd had cake at home, just the two of them, chocolate with the specific frosting she preferred, and he'd watched her blow out the candles with her whole face pressed into the effort of it, eyes scrunched, completely serious. And he'd thought about standing in a parking lot in November with $11.40 in his pocket trying to do the arithmetic of a life that didn't add up. The arithmetic was different now. Not easy. He wasn't someone who used the word easy about money because he'd learned young that the word invited complacency, and complacency had a way of collecting interest. But workable. Stable in the specific way that meant you could stop doing the math every morning before your eyes were fully open. He'd moved them to a slightly larger apartment in January, still in the same neighborhood. Emma had refused to leave Jasmine and Priya and Harold the crocus, approximately in that order of priority. 2 bedrooms with a window in the kitchen that caught the afternoon light, which he hadn't known he wanted until he had it. The after-school program was untouched. Emma still got the chocolate milk. It was Vivian who suggested the park, though she didn't frame it as a suggestion so much as a question she asked on the phone in early April, almost offhandedly. The park on Delmore Street, is it warm enough yet, do you think? He'd understood what she was asking. Probably, yeah. I've been thinking about going back, she said, not elaborating further, just putting the idea in the air between them. With purpose or just to go? A pause. Both, maybe. I want to bring something for the bench. She paused again. That sounds strange when I say it out loud. It doesn't, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Would you and Emma want to come? He thought about it. He thought about Emma on that bench in November, explaining Rosie the flying elephant to a woman she didn't know in a cold park, with the complete absence of self-consciousness that children brought to moments adults would spend 6 years avoiding. He thought about how Emma had asked if the woman was okay. How that question, innocent and unremarkable from a 7-year-old's perspective, had been the thing that changed the direction of an evening, and through some improbable chain of events, had changed the direction of several lives. Yeah, he said. We'll come. They met on a Saturday in mid-April, when the temperature had finally committed to something above 50, and the trees in the park were at that specific stage of early green where everything looked slightly unreal, too vivid against the gray of the pavement and the buildings behind. Vivian was there when Adrian and Emma arrived, standing near the entrance to the park, in a jacket that was not quite warm enough for the day, but close. She had a tendency he'd observed over 4 months of knowing her in a context where he could observe such things, to underestimate the cold, which seemed incongruous with her general precision about most other things. Emma spotted her from half a block away. Vivian! She said it the way she said the names of people she was genuinely pleased to see, with a full commitment that adults usually spent years learning to perform and never quite got right because they were performing it. For Emma, it was just what happened when your face encountered someone you liked. Vivian turned, and something in her face did the thing it did when she encountered Emma, opened slightly, lost some of its habitual guardedness, became for a moment the face of someone who was just a person standing in a park on a spring morning, rather than the person who'd spent the previous week in tense negotiations with a board member and a union representative and a logistics software vendor all simultaneously. She crouched down to Emma's level. Hi. I brought Rosie, Emma said, producing the small purple elephant from her coat pocket. She wanted to come. Of course she did. Vivian looked at the elephant with the grave seriousness Emma's animals deserved and received. It's a good day for flying. It's a little windy, though, Emma said, which was true. She doesn't love wind, it messes up her direction. Smart of her to be selective. Emma pocketed Rosie and looked around the park. Which bench? She said, because she knew, the way she knew most things Adrian hadn't fully explained, why they were here. Adrian and Vivian looked at each other briefly. Second one, he said. They walked to it together, the three of them, mismatched in every way that was visible and connected in a way that was not. The thing between them too specific to have a name that fit, not friendship exactly, not professional relationship, not gratitude. Some compound of all of those with something underneath that didn't have a word yet. The bench was exactly as it had been in November. Same iron frame, same weathered slats. Someone had carved initials into the left armrest at some point in the past. MT plus RK in a heart that was lopsided and earnest. The work of someone who had thought this moment was permanent, who'd wanted to leave a mark on something that would outlast them. It had outlasted them in the indifferent way benches did, regardless of what had happened to MT and RK in the years since. Vivian sat down on the bench. She looked at it for a moment, at the place where she'd sat in November with cold hands and an empty cup and 6 hours of being looked through behind her. She looked at it with the specific expression of someone measuring distance. Emma sat next to her, uninvited and completely comfortable about it. Adrian sat on Emma's other side. The three of them on a bench in a park on a Saturday in April, the city doing its thing around them. Pigeons, a dog walker, a teenager on a skateboard who miscalculated an edge and caught himself badly and then looked around to see if anyone had noticed, which everyone had, but no one mentioned because that was the social contract of near misses in public spaces. I've been thinking, Vivian said, to no one in particular, or to both of them, or to the park, about what I was doing when you walked up. Sitting, Emma said helpfully. Yes. A small pause. I was about to give up. On the whole thing, I was going to call it and go back to being myself, I suppose, the version of myself that doesn't sit on cold benches. She looked at the bench's surface, at a chip in the paint near her knee. And then Emma asked if I was okay. Emma looked up from where she'd been inspecting the initials carved into the armrest. I remember, she said. You looked cold. I was. And sad, Emma added. Vivian looked at her. Adrian watched his daughter say the thing that adults spent so much energy not saying. The observed thing, the accurate thing, the thing that required no tact to say because Emma didn't yet understand why you would need tact to say a true thing to someone who was experiencing it. Yeah, Vivian said quietly. And sad. Emma nodded. That was enough for her. She went back to examining the initials. Do you think MT and RK are still together? She asked. I don't know, Vivian said. I think they are, Emma said. They made it into a heart. That's a big commitment. Adrian pressed his lips together. Next to him, he felt rather than saw Vivian do the same. They sat for a while. No agenda, which was unusual for all three of them in different ways. Adrian ran on lists, Vivian ran on schedules, Emma ran on projects. But the morning was temperate, and the park was not crowded, and there was something about the bench itself that seemed to make urgency feel unnecessary. After a while, Vivian said, I want to tell you something about what happened this week. Adrian looked at her. Good something or bad something? Both, I think. The Q3 technology implementation, the one the board conditioned the restructuring reversal on, we hit our first major benchmark 2 weeks ahead of schedule. She said it without triumph, more like someone reporting something they were still processing the reality of. The efficiency gains are tracking above the projection Gerald built, which means the argument for maintaining the workforce plan is stronger than it was in January. That's good, Adrian said. Gerald is now cautiously optimistic, she said, which from Gerald is roughly equivalent to anyone else throwing a parade. A beat. He told me in a meeting on Thursday that my instinct on the timeline had been correct, and that he wanted to note that for the record. Then he immediately moved to the next agenda item. That's his parade, Adrian said. That's exactly his parade. She looked at the middle distance. There's still the union negotiation in the spring. And two of the board members who voted against the modified plan are looking for any foothold to revisit the question. It's not, I want to be clear, it's not resolved. The pressure doesn't go away because one quarter goes well. But this quarter went well. This quarter went well. He nodded. He thought about 4,000 people who didn't know any of this, who went to work on Monday morning and came home on Friday evening and paid rent and bought cereal and monitored crocuses and had no knowledge of a board meeting in January, of a woman on a park bench in November, of a conversation about whether 300 to 500 of them would still have their jobs in spring. They just had their jobs. They just had their ordinary days inside those jobs. The invisible infrastructure of decisions made above them, the meetings and the memos and the Q3 benchmarks. All of it was walls they never saw, holding up ceilings they lived under. He thought about that a lot. He'd always thought about it in the abstract, in the way most people did. The sense that there were forces operating at a scale too large to feel personally. What was different now was that he could see both sides of it. He'd been on the floor, and he was now, in a much more limited way than Vivian, but in a real way, on the other side of some of those decisions. He knew what it felt like to be the person the decision happened to. He was learning what it felt like to be one of the people responsible for not letting the decision be cruel when it didn't have to be. That knowing, he'd come to believe, was not replaceable by any amount of financial modeling or organizational theory. You couldn't spreadsheet your way to understanding what it felt like when the floor went out. You either knew it or you didn't. And the people who didn't know it weren't necessarily bad people. They were just missing a frequency, operating without a signal that changed what the numbers meant in their hands. He'd said something close to this in a different form to Garrett in one of their Friday calls in February, and Garrett had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Write that down, the way you just said it," and then moved to the next item because Garrett always moved to the next item, but he'd said write it down, which meant it had landed somewhere. He'd written it down. He didn't know yet what would come of it. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said to Vivian. "Of course. When you were sitting here by yourself, in November." She looked at the bench between them, then up at Vivian. "Were you scared?" The question landed in the specific way that Emma's questions sometimes landed. Not aggressively, not challengingly, just with the directness of a child who had no investment in the answer being a comfortable one, who asked because she wanted to know. Vivian thought about it, genuinely, visibly. "Yes," she said, "in a way I didn't expect." A pause. Not scared of being hurt or anything physical. More, she looked for the word. Scared of what it would feel like if no one stopped, if the whole day went by and no one saw me. "But we stopped," Emma said. "You did." "Daddy changed direction," Emma said. "Because I asked." "I know." Emma seemed to turn this over. "What would have happened if I hadn't asked?" Vivian looked at her for a long moment. "I honestly don't know," she said. "I'd like to think I would have gone back to my life and still changed some of what I was going to change. But I don't know that." A pause. "Maybe it would have been smaller. Maybe the whole thing would have been more contained. A private experience I processed quietly and moved on from." She paused again. The asking mattered. The fact that you noticed and said something out loud, that was the thing that started it. Emma absorbed this with a 7-year-old's non-drama about large statements. Then she looked at Adrian. "Daddy said anyone would have done it." "I said a lot of people would have done it if they'd stopped," he corrected. "That's different." "He's splitting a hair," Emma told Vivian. "He really is," Vivian agreed. "I'm not splitting a hair," Adrian said, aware that he was now outnumbered in a way that was becoming a pattern. "I'm making a meaningful distinction about—" "It's a hair," Emma said, and went back to looking at the initials on the armrest, case closed. Vivian was smiling. The real smile. The one without architecture. And it stayed for longer than usual. They walked after a while. No particular destination. Just moving because the day was good enough to move through. Emma held both their hands, one on each side, which she'd arranged without announcement, and which both adults had simply accepted because the alternative was a conversation that neither of them needed to have. She walked between them and narrated the park. the dog whose ear was folded wrong, the tree that was definitely older than 100 years because look at it, the squirrel that was clearly in a hurry and clearly going to be disappointed when it got there. At one point she said without looking at either of them, "Are you guys friends?" Adrian glanced at Vivian over Emma's head. Vivian glanced back. "Yes," Vivian said. "At first you were strangers," Emma said, "and then you were—" She seemed to search for the sequence. "And now you're friends." "That's usually how it works," Adrian said. "Jasmine was a stranger first," Emma said thoughtfully. "And then she lent me her pink eraser, and I lent her my ruler, and then we were friends. It was fast." "Sometimes it's fast," Vivian said. "What was slow about yours?" Another glance over Emma's head. Vivian's expression had something in it that was half amusement, half something she was working out. "We had to figure out the right context," Adrian said, which was the most honest way he could put it to a 7-year-old, which was also, he thought, fairly honest to an adult. Emma considered this. "Like how you have to figure out the right container for something," she said, "so it doesn't spill." He had no idea where she'd gotten that. He also thought it was exactly right. "Yeah," he said. "Exactly like that." Later, when Emma had found a patch of early dandelions near the park's east path and was engaged in the deeply serious business of selecting the right one to blow, Vivian and Adrian stood a few feet away and were, for a moment, just two people watching a child. "She's going to be someone," Vivian said, quietly enough that it was only for him. "She already is." "I know. I mean, later." She paused. "She's going to figure things out that take most people 40 years. And she's going to do it without the thing most of us have, the scar tissue, the armor." He watched Emma hold a dandelion up to the light, examining it. "I hope not," he said. "I hope she keeps the things she has. But she'll get bumped up against enough things. Everyone does. You'll make sure she's okay." "I'll try. She'll make sure she's okay too. She's not—" He searched for it. "She's not fragile, she's open, which people confuse for fragile. It's actually the opposite." Vivian looked at him. "Is that what you think?" "I think the people who stay open cost themselves something. Constantly. Every time they notice the thing that other people manage not to notice. Every time they ask if someone's okay." He watched Emma select her dandelion with the gravity of a life choice. "But I think what you get from staying open is also something the closed version of you can't access. And I think she's already figured that out, which is—" He paused. "I don't know how she figured that out, but she has." Vivian was quiet. Not the composed quiet of a board meeting or a professional interaction, a different kind. "I've been thinking about something since January," she said, "about the company, about what I want it to actually be." A beat. "Not the mission statement version, the actual version." "Which is?" "A place that understands that the people doing the work are the work," she said. "Not a resource, not a cost center. The actual substance of the thing." She was watching Emma now, too. "I know that's not a new idea. Everyone says some version of it, but there's a gap between saying it and the decisions you make at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday when the numbers are what they are and the board is what it is." She paused. "I want to close that gap. I don't know if I can close it completely. I'm probably going to make decisions in the next year that I'll have to defend to myself at 3 in the morning." "Yeah," he said. "That's the job." "I know." A beat. "I just wanted someone to know that I know what the job actually is, that I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not naive about it, but I'm also not—" Another stop. "Not willing to stop trying," he said. She looked at him. "Not willing to stop trying," she said. Emma blew the dandelion. The seeds scattered in the light April wind, white and drifting. Some going up and some going sideways, and some immediately abandoning the enterprise and dropping straight to the ground, which was the honest truth about most dispersal patterns. Most things landed close, and a few went far, and you couldn't tell from the blowing which would be which. Emma watched them go with the expression of someone who had released something into the world and was at peace with the uncertainty of where it landed. "Did you make a wish?" Vivian called to her. Emma turned. "No," she said. I just like the way they look when they go, Dad. Adrian took Emma home in the early afternoon. She fell asleep in the car on the way back, which she occasionally did on Saturdays when she'd spent enough energy on being alive that her body simply filed a claim without consultation. He carried her up from the parking lot, her head on his shoulder, her breath slow and warm against his neck, and thought about the fact that she weighed 5 pounds more than she had in November, which he'd noticed because he still carried her sometimes, and the difference was perceptible and was the kind of thing that reminded you that time was doing something regardless of whether you were paying attention to it. He put her down on her bed without waking her and left her door open the way she liked it. He went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table with the afternoon light coming through the window he'd wanted without knowing he wanted it, and he sat with the day. He was not a person who spent a lot of time looking backward. Forward, and the lists and the next problem. That was his natural orientation. Had been since the 4 months at 24 when the floor had first gone out, and he'd learned that backward was where the quicksand was. But there were moments when the forward motion paused, and you sat in it, in the actual weight of the time that had passed, and it was its own kind of necessary. November to April was 5 months. In 5 months he had lost a job, shared a meal with a stranger, applied to positions that went into voids, interviewed in a room that turned out to contain a woman he'd already met, taken a role he was still not entirely sure he was big enough for, helped keep 300 to 500 people in their jobs without any of them knowing it, watched his daughter turn 7 and name a crocus herald, and develop opinions about cloud movement and the structural integrity of long-distance friendships. 5 months. The dandelion seeds blew a long way in 5 months. He thought about what he'd said to Vivian about staying open. He believed it. He believed it the way he believed the things that had been tested by his own experience and come out true on the other side. Not as philosophy, not as inspiration, but as something practical and earned and real. The cost of it was attention. The cost of staying open was that you noticed things other people had trained themselves not to notice. And noticing required a decision, and the decision required something from you, and you didn't always have enough left over to give it. And sometimes you made the wrong call, and sometimes you were tired, and sometimes you walked past instead of stopping. He knew that about himself. He'd walked past plenty. He wasn't a saint and didn't have the appetite for the performance of being one. He was a man who had a daughter and a job and a small apartment with good kitchen light, who made lists and drank real coffee and still occasionally sat in parking lots when things hit him harder than he was ready for. He got it wrong in specific cataloged ways that he could list if asked. He was in the middle of several things he didn't know the ending of yet. But on one particular evening in November, tired and broke and already past the point where most people would have changed direction, he hadn't changed direction back. He'd sat down on a bench. He'd bought a meal he couldn't afford. He'd given away $5 he didn't have to spare. And he'd done it because Emma had asked if a woman was okay. And because he knew what it felt like when no one asked. And because the right thing was sometimes just the right thing, unremarkable and inconvenient and neither heroic nor optional, just the thing you did because you were still trying to be the kind of person who did it. That was all it was. He was clear-eyed about that. There was no larger version of it that needed to be made. It was a meal on a bench in some company and $5.40 of a cold evening. What it had made was something else, something that had its own shape now, its own momentum, its own particular chain of consequences reaching forward into futures he couldn't fully see. Carla Voss in her new office, 300 to 500 people in their jobs this spring, Emma's chocolate milk, a woman in a gray blazer sitting in a park on a Saturday morning watching dandelion seeds go. He didn't claim credit for those things. He knew the chain was longer than one link, knew that Vivian's character had done most of the real work, knew that Garrett's exactingness and Petra's efficiency and Gerald's frustrated professionalism had all been part of how the thing had moved. He'd been one decision in a long sequence of decisions. That was what one decision was. That was also what one decision could be. He thought that was worth knowing. He thought it was the kind of thing that was genuinely useful, not as a lesson you displayed on a wall, but as a working piece of equipment, something you carried and used. The knowledge that you didn't have to change everything. You had to change direction. You had to stop, or sometimes just slow down enough to notice. The rest was bigger than you and happened without you, mostly, but it needed the stop. He sat with his coffee and the afternoon light and the sound of his daughter breathing in the next room, and he thought about how he'd tell Emma this someday. Not the full version. The full version was too many parts to carry at once, but the core of it, the thing he'd learned from the sequence of his own choices and their consequences. That real wealth wasn't a number. That wasn't new. Everyone said that. But the sharper version, the one that had been tested, that the smallest sacrifice made in the right moment could travel further than you'd ever be able to track. That the $5 you couldn't afford to give were sometimes exactly the $5 that mattered. That you couldn't know which moment was the one. So you had to be the person you wanted to be in the ordinary ones, the unremarkable ones, the ones where no one would know if you looked away. He'd tell her that, when she was old enough to hold it without it becoming a weight, when she'd seen enough of the world to understand what it meant that it was hard. Or maybe he'd just let her keep being who she was, and she'd figure it out herself by the routes she took, the ones he couldn't predict and wouldn't want to. Maybe what he owed her wasn't the lesson, but the example. Just the ongoing work of being the version of himself that she'd shown him he was capable of being, the version she'd described when she was 6 years old and handed him a purple stuffed elephant for luck before an interview that turned out to matter. "You're going to get the job," she'd said, with absolute certainty, on no evidence at all except her own conviction. He smiled at his coffee cup. He'd gotten the job. Vivian sat in her office late that Saturday evening, which was not unusual. She often came in on weekends, not out of compulsion, but because the building was quiet and the quiet made thinking easier. She sat at her desk with the lights of the city visible through the 14th floor window and a cup of tea going cold on the corner of her desk and a draft on her laptop that she'd been working on for 3 weeks. It was an internal document, not a mission statement. She was allergic to mission statements. Had been since the first one she'd written at 24 had sounded, when she read it back 2 years later, like something a person said when they didn't know yet what they meant. This was different, a framework of sorts for the decisions the company would make about its people. Not a policy, not an HR directive, but a set of principles with actual teeth to them, principles designed to survive being tested by a bad quarter, or a board under pressure, or a CFO with a compelling spreadsheet. She'd been drafting it in pieces, pulling from conversations and observations and the uncomfortable specific knowledge that came from a November afternoon on a park bench. She'd shown it to Garrett, who had read it in silence for 12 minutes, and then said 3 words. "The intent is right." From Garrett, that was a standing ovation. She hadn't shown it to anyone else yet. She was still working out the language for the hardest parts, the parts about what happened when financial pressure and workforce stability came into conflict, the parts that tried to name a principle for how to navigate that without either pretending the conflict didn't exist or defaulting to the easy solution that protected the number and cost the person. She wrote for a while, crossed things out, rewrote them. The city outside the window did what it did, indifferent and ceaseless, the specific music of it coming through the glass in a way that was less sound than vibration, more felt than heard. She thought about Emma blowing the dandelion, about what she'd said. "I just like the way they look when they go." She wrote a sentence and then sat back and read it. "We do not make decisions about people as if they were positions. Positions are structures. People are the reason the structures exist at all." She sat with that for a moment. Then she kept writing. In the apartment on the other side of the city, Emma woke from her nap at 4:30, came out to the kitchen, still sleep-creased, found her father at the table with a cold cup of coffee and whatever he was thinking about, and climbed onto the chair next to him without being asked. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "Stuff," he said. She leaned against his arm. He put his arm around her. "Good stuff or bad stuff?" He considered. "Both, I think. Mostly good." She seemed to accept this as a satisfactory accounting. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon was tipping toward evening, the light going amber and long, the kind of light that made everything look more considered than it was. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah." When Vivian was sad on the bench, and we stopped, she paused. Was that the right thing? He looked at the side of her face, the sleep crease still on her cheek, the way she asked the question like she already knew but wanted to hear him say it. "Yeah, Em, he said. That was the right thing. She nodded slowly, like she was filing it. Even though it was hard, she said. It wasn't that hard. You gave her your last money. How do you know it was my last? She looked up at him with the expression that said this question also barely deserved an answer. She had always known things. She had always, in ways he couldn't trace or explain, understood more of the situation than he told her. He'd stopped being surprised by it and started being quietly, constantly grateful for it. Yeah, he said. Even though it was hard. She was quiet for a moment, then, I think that's how you know it was the right thing. Because it was hard. He looked at her. Easy things are usually just comfortable things, she said. She said it the way she sometimes said things that were too old for her. Not precociously, not performing wisdom, just stating what seemed obvious to her. The right thing is usually the one that costs something. He sat with that. Where do you get this stuff? He said. She shrugged. I think about things, she said. When you think, ideas come. He pulled her a little closer. She let him, settling into his side with the easy weight of a person who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Outside, the amber light moved across the wall. Harold the Crocus was probably doing something interesting down on the front step. The city was doing its thing, the vast, indifferent, beautiful machine of it. Millions of people inside millions of moments, most of them unremarkable. A few of them hinge points that wouldn't be recognized as such until long after they'd passed. Somewhere on a 14th floor, a woman was writing a sentence about what people were worth. Somewhere in 3 warehouse facilities spread across a 60-mile radius, people were finishing Saturday shifts, clocking out, picking up kids, buying groceries, paying rent, living the ordinary days of their ordinary lives inside the invisible walls of a decision someone had made to not take those lives apart. And here, in a kitchen with good afternoon light, a man and his daughter sat together in the quiet of the evening coming on, and did not talk, because there was nothing that needed to be said, because some things were complete without being spoken, because sometimes the right moment didn't announce itself or ask for acknowledgement or require any particular word. It just was what it was. And that was enough.